Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
cute people, I think. Just come for yourself. That's Michelle here.
She really wants him behind you. She'll ask him to move. As much as you might like to think.
Thank you, colleagues. We're going to resume this afternoon with portfolio questions. And question 1 and 2 have been with, this is on economy, fair work and culture. Questions 1 and 2 have been withdrawn. Question 3, Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it takes to ensure that its labour market strategy protects the rights and pay of people in sectors perceived as undervalued or insecure.
Minister Ivan McKee.
The labour market strategy sets out the Scottish Government's approach to delivering a fair, inclusive labour market that drives our country's economy. The strategy, and particularly its commitment to fair work, reflects all aspects of labour standards and supports the vision of Scotland becoming a fair work nation by 2025. The Scottish Government has repeatedly called for the devolution of employment law, a position supported by the STUC, but whilst it remains reserved to the UK Government, we will do all we can within our current powers to protect workers, including those in precarious employment. For example, in 2019-20, we have promoted payment of the real living wage by increasing funding to Living Wage Scotland to £380,000. We continue to encourage all employers to pay the real living wage, including through our procurement powers, and we are targeting sectors with long-standing low-pay culture and are continuing to reduce the gender pay gap to the lowest level of any part of the UK. We want to ensure that we create a successful labour market that works for everyone by delivering fair work where all employees are treated well and are paid a decent wage.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? I very much welcome the fact that there is ongoing work and that the STUC are being made aware of this. Just in the last few days, just reflecting on the care sector, for example, undervalued short-term contracts, there is a real challenge here about making sure we're resilient over the next few weeks. But I wonder what work the Scottish Government is doing to look at how we redesign different sectors of employment so that we create new career opportunities and take employment from what is currently perceived as undervalued or insecure to being more secure, to being valued properly, so that when we have a shock as we have at the moment, people are still in work and they are still able to go to jobs. And I know that there is some work being done in the care sector to think about how we can reshape those opportunities. But will the Minister undertake to look at that and to keep the Parliament updated, not just on the care sector, but other sectors where we could see more meaningful change over the next few weeks and months?
Minister.
Yeah, I thank the member for that supplementary. Of course, we all recognise the huge importance of the social care sector, and especially at these particularly difficult times. And I think that there's two parts to that. You should be aware that the Scottish Government is committed to rolling out the real living wage in that sector, and that's something we've been delivering for a number of years now, and to continue to work with trade unions to ensure that people in that sector are treated the way they should be according to fair work principles. And there is also the longer term ambition, which we are of course hugely committed to make those jobs more valuable and more secure, and that can be through a range of activities, including as more technology comes into the sector, through innovation, and those jobs become more valuable and more highly regarded. And that's something I think that we're all committed to, and the current situation, I think, especially drives that home.
There are actually 4 potential supplementaries on this, but maybe we'll, if members are concise, we'll get through them. Angus MacDonald.
As the Minister's alluded to in his initial answer, many aspects of employment are reserved, including pay. Does the Minister agree that the full devolution of employment powers would better equip the Scottish Government to protect and improve workers' rights?
Minister Ivan McKee.
Yes, of course we do. It's something we've repeatedly called for, and as I highlighted, it's something that the STUC joins us in those calls, and it's something that I would encourage other parties that haven't already done so in this Parliament to join that call, because the more of those powers we have devolved to this Parliament, the better able we are to deliver for the workers we're talking about.
Neil Findlay.
The Minister says we all recognise the importance of the care sector. Clearly, we don't all recognise the importance of the care sector, or it wouldn't be a sector defined by low pay, insecure work and a lack of career structure. I think care workers will be looking at us now when we say these things, and will be looking for action. One of the ways in which we can change the whole ethos and culture of care is if we return to national collective bargaining. Now, both the employers and the trade unions want that. Will the government facilitate that discussion so we return to national collective bargaining, so we never get in the position again that carers are treated in the way that they are at the moment?
Minister.
The issue of collective bargaining is something that's being addressed by my colleague Jamie Hepburn through the Fair Work First and the work that's going on there. And I know that a number of sectors have been identified and working with the STUC to map out the position on that at the moment and to understand how we take that forward. And I know that that's something that he's engaged in those conversations and taking that forward.
Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I want to ask about insecure employment. I have just received an email from workers in a large firm who are on 0 hours contracts, and they've just been made unemployed, and they're naturally very stressed and worried about that. Can the the Minister advise how the Scottish Government is engaging with businesses to promote fair work practices at this very worrying time?
Minister Ivan McKee.
Yeah, thank you for that question. With regards to the 0 hours contract, of course that legislation is reserved to the UK Government, and the Scottish Government firmly opposes the inappropriate use of such contracts and other non-standard types of employment that offer workers little or no security. And it's something that we are continuing to work to move that agenda forward where we have the power to do so. But as I say, clearly that in its entirety is reserved, which makes it difficult for us to move forward as fast as we would like to on that issue.
And Claire Baker.
Thank you. When talking about insecure and underpaid work, the Minister will be aware that people working in the creative sector are often expected to work for free, either by their performances being free or being extensively underpaid for the work that they do produce. Will the labour market strategy work recognise this sector and these issues that have been identified?
Minister.
Yeah, of course, that sector will be considered by the labour market strategy, and I refer back to my comments earlier that 0 hours contracts and other inappropriate use of non-standard types of employment are something that this government is opposed to, which offer workers little or no job security, and we intend to work with other STUC and others to address that issue as best we can, given the powers that we have in this Parliament.
Thank you very much. Questions 4, 5 and 6 have been withdrawn. Question 7, Michelle Ballantyne.
To ask the Scottish Government what role it has in promoting the uptake of UK Government employability services.
Minister Ivan McKee.
Under the Scotland Act 2016, the Scottish Government's duty is in making sure disabled people and those at risk of long-term unemployment get the support they require to move into and towards work. This is now taken forward through Fair Start Scotland. Fair Start Scotland has already supported over 19,000 people, with over 5,000 people moving into work in a dignified and respectful way. We work with the UK Government and other partners ensuring that services are aligned and delivered for the people who need them most.
Michelle Ballantyne.
I thank the Minister for that. And I agree, Fair Start Scotland is the devolved employability services. But recently it did actually release some troubling statistics showing that only 276 people who left the programme secured a job for a year. And even more troubling is that in May 2019, the Scottish Government said Fair Start Scotland will support 38,000 people over a 3-month period. But a month later, the Scottish Government published material saying the programme will reach a minimum of 38,000 people by 2023. In a parliamentary question I asked to follow up the issue, it was confirmed that the date would be 2023. Clearly, in the current crisis, many people who were already struggling to get a job that met their needs are going to be even more worried now. So can the Minister just clarify these numbers? And can I ask why the targets were moved in relation to this important service?
Minister Ivan McKee.
Yeah, I think it's important the member recognises that we're addressing the most vulnerable people furthest from the labour market through this programme, and it's going to take time to bed in. I would draw attention to the fact already mentioned that 19,000 people have been supported, with 5,000 moving into work. And it's also important to recognise that a recent evaluation report showed that 92% of participants on the programme felt that they'd been treated with dignity and respect, and 80% that they had a choice about the type of support received. And that shows that the approach that this government takes with regard to these employability services.
Thank you very much. Question number 8, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reported concerns that the suspension of grants by Scottish Enterprise is because of organisational mismanagement and not success in stimulating demand for strategic investment.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
Scottish Enterprise always has to consider how best to focus available resources, including grants, in 2021 because of its success in stimulating demand for strategic investment. It already has significant commitments for the year and beyond. In fact, to the end of February, 179 offers for large capital grants from Scottish Enterprise, totalling £103 million, have been accepted. This includes £66 million for 48 R&D projects and £29 million for 82 regional selective assistance projects. This is more offers and more associated capital grant funding than in any of the previous 3 financial years. Scottish Enterprise are also committed to working closely with customers and partners to understand the impact of COVID-19 and will tie in with the £2.2 billion worth of measures the Scottish Government are bringing forward by supporting business through the COVID-19 helpline, as well as the Find Business Support Gov UK website, which is the best way for business to find the information they need.
Pauline McNeill.
I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will appreciate that the landscape has somewhat changed since I laid the question, and I know what she says about the successes of Scottish Enterprise. But she will be aware that it literally ran out of cash well before the end of the financial year, and so that staff who were supposed to be helping businesses were unable to travel without the authority of 2 managers before they could travel. Some suggestions that 40% grants were offered when companies only expected 30%. I'm only asking the Cabinet Secretary if these things are not true. They're certainly heavily rumoured, and when the time is appropriate, and I heavily caveat this, whenever the time is appropriate, would the Cabinet Secretary just look a bit more closely into some of these things, so may absolutely make sure that the reason that they ran out for money is for the reasons that she's given today.
Cabinet Secretary.
It's very important that Scottish Enterprise make sure that every single penny of public funds are there to develop business. That's what they did. I don't base things on rumour. I certainly want to hold them to account. That's my job, and I have already done so. But I am confident in doing so that they have managed to make the most, as in I've reported, in terms of maximising and much better figures than even previous years, all of their income. At no point did they stop supporting business, and I want to reassure on that point.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Recognising the critical role of Scottish Enterprise at this time, can the Cabinet Secretary provide additional information on efforts to upscale the coronavirus business hotline?
Cabinet Secretary.
Clearly, as I've indicated previously, there is heavy demand on that hotline, and also, importantly, on the website. I would encourage all businesses to access the website first. The Find Business Support website has a lot of the frequently asked questions, most of which are about the UK Government's announcement just on Tuesday night and hours from yesterday. Clearly, we want to make sure that the business rates will be applicable immediately from April when they come in, and the release there, 100%, will be very welcome. But also in terms of some of
the additional information that are required. We want to focus the helpline, which has had on Tuesday 2,300 calls. Yesterday it was 1,850. It has the resources that they need. There's 5,000 businesses are now in receipt of the COVID-19 email newsletter, and we're upskilling with 80 additional staff to help screen those calls. But I would appeal to members to direct businesses to the website in the first instance, because we understand a great majority of the questions that are being asked would be dealt with on the website.
Thank you very much to the ministers and members. We're going to turn now to the next item of business.
The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on education, COVID-19. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney for up to 20 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, responding to the coronavirus pandemic is a matter of the greatest national importance, and the scale of the challenge in front of us is truly without precedent. Every aspect of our national life has been affected by this crisis, and sustaining our education system has been at the forefront of my mind. My priorities are to ensure the health and well-being of our children, young people and staff, and to maintain teaching and learning wherever this is possible, guided by the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and public health experts. I would like to place on record my sincere appreciation for the extraordinary work that all of the teaching and non-teaching staff in our schools and early learning and childcare settings have been doing to maintain educational continuity in these unprecedented days. The approach of the Scottish Government to this crisis has been to deliver clear and open communication with members of the public. When circumstances change, we need to set out the basis of that change, and that is the point we reached yesterday in relation to our schools. Firstly, scientific advice now highlights that closing schools will help to suppress the spread of coronavirus. Secondly, as people follow the advice issued on Monday, it is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain education provision. As a consequence of these two factors, the First Minister set out yesterday that schools and nursery closures for pupils are now inevitable. I want to be clear at the outset that what we are advising is this. At the end of tomorrow, schools and nurseries should ordinarily close for children and young people. Teaching, learning and support will continue, albeit in different ways for different groups of children. For the majority, this will be through distance learning and online learning, with different forms of ongoing contact with teachers, rather than in-school face-to-face teaching. Teachers and other staff who are well will continue to be working. Senior phase pupils with coursework for national qualifications to complete will be informed by their schools how to complete this. For vulnerable children and those who have parents or carers employed as key workers, local authorities are developing approaches to support them at this time. My statement today will provide more detail about what these mean in practice and how our teaching and education workforce can refocus their work to support pupils in a range of different ways in the weeks and months ahead. We want our local authorities to be able to exercise the necessary flexibility in the use of school buildings and other settings to enable the education workforce to operate in new and different ways to support learners. There are three ways in which this should be the case, and we have discussed and agreed this approach with local government. Firstly, we need to continue to support vulnerable children. We will not cut adrift vulnerable young people who often rely on school life for hot meals or for a safe, nurturing and supportive environment. Secondly, we want to deliver as much educational continuity as possible. We want local authorities and teachers to do all they can to ensure educational continuity for our children and young people, with a particular focus on S4 to S6 pupils who need to complete coursework for national qualifications. Teachers can provide educational continuity for children in the broad general education in a variety of ways, for example through setting weekly learning tasks and emailing these to families where possible, or using Glow and other online learning platforms. I am confident that the teaching profession will respond in a variety of imaginative, creative and stimulating ways to support continuity in learning for pupils. And thirdly, key workers. We are clear that we must support local authorities to put in place arrangements that ensure the children of key workers who do not have another parent or carer at home who can look after them during the day have continuing access to all-age learning and childcare that allows their parents or carers to participate in the national response to COVID-19. For example, our doctors and nurses must continue to be available to support the fight against this virus. I will go on to set out what this is likely to mean in practice, but I would like to be clear about one thing. This may mean that local authorities opt to keep some settings open with reduced staffing, but operating in a very different way. Or they may create local hubs and use community facilities in different ways. It may also mean that they work with private and third sector providers of childcare, including childminders, to deliver childcare to key workers. Indeed, I would strongly encourage that they prioritise the use of these facilities to ensure continued support for that critical sector. Amongst all of these models, we will balance the extent of physical provision in buildings with the risk of undermining the health interventions. In doing so, we will of course be led by the advice of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Speaking specifically to parents and carers whose children do not fall into these categories, we know this is a difficult time and there will be support for you too. We know that a lot of parents will be thinking about how they balance working from home with looking after children. These parents are not expected to be a teacher or to recreate the school day, but we want to make sure that they feel supported to help their children, and the support will be available through schools, through the provision of resources and suggestions as the first point of call in providing this advisory support. I would also highlight the excellent advice already provided to children and young people by Young Scott. We will be working with a range of partners to find the best way to keep children and young people updated and supported with the latest information. I will of course take questions at the end of my statement, but I will make clear now that we do not pretend at this stage to have all of the answers that are required in this situation. We are working with local authorities and partners to ensure that vulnerable children and young people can continue to benefit from the learning, care and support that schools and nurseries provide for them. Local authorities will need to take into account issues of child protection, welfare, poverty, children with complex additional support needs, and the need to provide access to food for young people who need it. I'm not going to set a definitive definition of what a vulnerable child is. Our schools and local authorities know our children and families well and are best placed to identify which children need care, protection and support the most during the period that lies ahead. In planning to support young people, the needs of young people will be taken into account. Those with complex additional support needs who are learning and living in residential special schools will continue to receive the care and support they require. Plans will specifically take into account any long-term health conditions in order to protect the health and well-being of this group. I know that local authorities are creatively considering different ways of supporting young people with different needs during this period, for example using outreach models and joining up available staff to provide care, support and continuity. We have made great strides in recent years through increasing multi-agency working, and now is the time for professionals and services to work together in new, dynamic ways which meet local needs. All Chief Social Work Officers have now been asked that special consideration is given to identifying and supporting vulnerable children at increased risk, for example, lone parents who have become too unwell to look after their own children. We have already stated our commitment to work with local authorities to continue the provision of free school meals, which both reduce costs to families and ensure provision of healthy and nutritious food. Multiple options are being planned for by local authorities, including the successful model already deployed in Shetland, where direct payments and vouchers have been provided to families whose children are entitled to free school meals. Other local authorities are considering opening community campuses to provide meals or to enable young people or families to collect food. A £350 million package of support for our communities was announced yesterday, which includes establishing a £70 million food fund to support households who may be worried about accessing food. These additional funds will also support the continued provision of free school meals, ensuring continued support for families who need it within their communities. Elsewhere, we will relax the guidance on the use of pupil equity funding to provide further flexibility for head teachers and local authorities to support our most vulnerable children and their needs during this time. This flexibility will also apply to schools and local authorities in receipt of Challenge Authority and schools programme funding. I believe that this approach, together with our local authority, children's services and community partners, will enable the continuation of vital support for Scotland's vulnerable children and young people. Presiding Officer, I now wish to turn to the 2020 exam diet. In all of our history, Scotland has never cancelled the exams. Since 1888, they have been held every May or June without fail. In the midst of 2 world wars, the exams went ahead. It is a measure of the gravity of the challenge we now face that I must today announce the exams will not go ahead this year. I am aware of how significant a step this is. Indeed, it is an unprecedented one in unprecedented times. Scotland's exam diet has never been cancelled before. Whilst the protection of life is our overriding priority here, we must do our utmost to ensure that the interests and life chances of our young people, due to sit exams from the end of April this year, are protected. Their achievements must be rightly and fairly recognised. I want the 2020 cohort to hold their heads high and gain the qualifications and awards that they deserve after many years of hard work. I know they will be very worried by the situation they face, and I want them to be assured that we are doing all that we can to deliver the best outcome for them. Scotland's Chief Examining Officer has advised me that with the support of the wider education system, a credible certification model can be put in place that can command confidence in the absence of the exam diet to ensure that young people in our schools and colleges who, through no fault of their own, are unable to sit exams are not in any way disadvantaged. I anticipate that this model will use coursework, teacher assessments of estimated grades and prior attainment as the basis of certification. In order for such an approach to be effective, the Scottish Qualifications Authority will require relevant units to be completed and coursework and teacher estimates of grades to be submitted by the agreed deadlines, or indeed sooner where that is possible. We are facing significant disruption at this time, but I appeal to our teachers and practitioners to do all that they can, safely, to meet these deadlines, and so allow qualifications to be awarded to their young people. So this ask is clear. Schools should submit coursework and teacher estimates as soon as they can and by the dates provided. I should stress that these elements form part of the suite of materials provided to the SQA every year when a full exam diet has been in operation. In addition to the hard work and the ongoing commitment of teachers, I also want to thank the Chief Examining Officer, Fiona Robertson, and all the staff at the SQA for their significant efforts already and those which will be delivered in achieving this task. I am aware of the scale of the task that they are facing, but I believe that this is in the best interests of our young people. They deserve to have their achievements recognised and to be able to take their next step in learning, life or work, and we cannot achieve this without the vital contribution of the Scottish Qualifications Authority. The Scottish people are key to our efforts in tackling this virus. Throughout the pandemic, we will need to ensure that key workers, for example NHS staff, have provisions in place that allow them to continue to play their vital role in the national response. The workforce of our health service, our care services and our emergency services have led the way in addressing this challenge, and enabling them to continue to work will help to save and protect lives across the country. At a national level, we are viewing key workers as those who work in posts which ensure that essential services can be delivered, or those who cover tasks within the local community which support the vulnerable and aid community resilience. To best serve local priorities, the exact definition of a key worker may vary across the diverse range of localities across Scotland. Urban and rural communities will rely on different key people doing their jobs in order to keep them safe, healthy, and with access to food and medicines that they need, for example. I am humbled by some of the early and creative thinking of our local authority partners. It was encouraging to see that in a response to their own circumstances, Shetland have been able to implement a hub arrangement to provide care and support for the children of key workers. Another authority plans to create a number of hubs to provide care, learning and a range of stimulating activities for children who may be vulnerable or those whose parents are key workers. They are drawing together a range of staff, teachers, active schools coordinators, CLD staff and others to provide a high-quality experience for the children who need us most during these unprecedented times. We will now continue to work with local partners and colleagues across the rest of the UK on provision for key workers as the situation develops. On early learning and childcare provision, as I stated in my opening remarks, it is likely that we will see many local authority nurseries close, but we do not expect or want to see all nurseries close. Our priorities are to ensure that key workers who need childcare can continue to access it and that we sustain private and third sector providers during this period of considerable uncertainty and challenge. We are advising private and third sector childcare providers that they can remain open so long as they refocus their operating models to support solely the children of critical workers and those families most in need of support. Childcare providers can also make a huge contribution to enabling key workers to remain in work. Local authorities are making plans for the provision of emergency childcare services to school-age children in their areas. In developing these plans, I have asked authorities to make maximum use of local childcare providers in the private and third sectors so that they can keep their doors open. Scottish ministers are committed to supporting our private and third sector childcare providers to remain viable. We are reviewing the package of general business support measures announced by the UK Government this week and working closely with our partners in the sector to identify what other support we can provide. As a first step, the First Minister guaranteed earlier today that the Scottish Government will continue funding streams which allow contractual payments to private and third sector providers, including childminders, for statutory early learning and childcare hours to continue. This is worth around £220 million to the sector in the year ahead. We are working closely with local authorities to ensure that they can adopt a position and provide assurance to providers that funding will continue as we all work together to respond to the pandemic. The Care Inspectorate is also publishing new operational registration guidance for all services, including the daycare of children's and childminding sector today, which will confirm a range of regulatory flexibilities to support the sector to function in these unprecedented times while ensuring that the safety of children remains paramount. Our response to the COVID-19 pandemic will clearly have an impact on the delivery of our early learning and childcare expansion commitment from August. We will provide a more detailed update to Parliament in due course. The Scottish Budget delivered additional revenue funding of £201 million in 2021 to support local authorities in delivering the 1,140 hours expansion. I will confirm to local authorities today that they can deploy that funding as flexibly as they need to support families and childcare providers during this period. Finally, colleges and universities operate in different circumstances, combining learning and research. We recognise that universities and colleges are introducing measures intended to minimise the potential disruption for students and staff and to ensure their well-being. For students, many universities and colleges are withdrawing face-to-face teaching and are making arrangements where possible for online teaching. The handling of this transition on the ground in extremely challenging circumstances is obviously key to reduce stress on students and staff. We look to our colleges and universities to make appropriate decisions in relation to their operations while prioritising the health of staff, students and the wider public. On student funding, the Student Awards Agency Scotland have robust business continuity measures in place to ensure their business services remain functioning. We will endeavour to continue to fund students on time. Given the nature of these unprecedented times, we will keep students updated throughout. We are working very closely with the Scottish Funding Council and institutions on business continuity actions that will support institutions, students and staff. The Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science had further calls with college and university principals this week and also with campus trade unions and NUS Scotland. We will now continue our engagement with local authorities and expect to work on further details into next week. We would like to see the refocused provision for the three key groups of children and young people that I have mentioned, those who are vulnerable, have parents or carers who are key workers, or who have coursework to complete for qualifications, in operation over the course of next week. Most, if not all, schools will have pupils from within these groups, and all head teachers and staff who are well will need to be part of the offer. Strong partnership working and clear communication between local authorities and their communities about the arrangements being put in place will be vital in the days ahead. I understand that people will naturally want clarity on how long this will last for and when the education system will return to full provision. The truth is, at this stage, we cannot know. People should not assume schools and nurseries will reopen after Easter. As the First Minister said yesterday, they may not be able to do so before the summer break. We will keep this under constant review. I am also aware that over holiday periods such as Easter, many schools, local authorities and out-of-school care providers offer services for children and their families. I would again encourage colleagues leading these services to see how they can continue for the key groups that I have highlighted today: vulnerable children, children of key workers, and in the case of young people completing national qualifications, continuing with planned approaches to supporting Easter revision activities. Now will be a time where we must all pull together and harness the strength of our local communities and the various professional groups who support children and families across Scotland. Continuation of education and continuation of the health and well-being of our children and young people should be at the centre of all that we do. So in summary, Presiding Officer, to the teachers or other education professionals listening to this, I encourage you to channel your professional knowledge and skills in different ways over the weeks and months that lie ahead. This may include teaching and learning in different ways, for example through the use of technology. It may be that your school will operate a skeleton staff to continue to support vulnerable children or children whose parents are key workers, or your local authority may offer these services through local hubs, examples of which I have cited today. We need our teachers and our education workforce more than ever over the weeks and months ahead, and I am confident that they will rise to the challenge with determination, creativity and, above all, with the interests of the children and young people who need them most at heart. Following this statement, I will set out the expectations that I have discussed during this statement in a letter to all local authority chief executives and directors of education and children's services. I want to offer thanks again to the local authorities for the proactive efforts they have already made to take decisive action in the best interests of children and young people, teachers and staff. Those foundations will be invaluable as we strive to deliver the education our children need in the most difficult of times.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I'll allow around 40 minutes for that. It would be helpful if those who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons, please. And I first of all call Jamie Green.
Thank you. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement and also add my thanks to those staff who work in all places of childcare and learning. Can also add to comments made by the First Minister yesterday that closing schools and nurseries is arguably one of the most difficult decisions a government will ever have to take, and the importance of schools and nurseries and their role in society, especially in these extraordinarily difficult times, a huge light has been shone on that importance. I do not envy some of the difficult decisions that the government has had to take today, and I know that not everyone will be happy with them. But let me say these benches commit their full support to the government on this issue. We do that today, we do that tomorrow, and we will do that every day in this unprecedented crisis. But I would like to pick up a few important points that have been raised from today's statement. The first is that of early years. On the assumption, Cabinet Secretary, that the majority of publicly controlled nurseries are indeed closing, providers out there will be looking for absolute clarity over whether or not the PVI sector nurseries are being told to close, they must close, and are only able to stay open if they are offering assistance with looking after key worker childcare. That leads me to the issue of the children of key workers in Scotland, and I accept this is a fluid issue. Local authorities will have some flexibility, but parents will be asking, where will they be sending the children, and when, and how will they know if they qualify? And the last point is that important one of SQA examinations. Given that exams are now not taking place, many parents and pupils will want to know how those awards will be given, when those grades will be awarded, and if this will be done in time to allow them to make that important move into further and higher education in the next academic year. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
John Swinney.
President Officer, can I thank Mr Green for the expression of support to the Government on these questions, and he's absolutely right. These are very difficult decisions to take, and I'm certain that particularly my decision on the SQ exam diet will not be universally welcomed, but I consider it, having weighed up carefully the three options which I expressed in my answer to Mr Simpson in Parliament on Tuesday, that this is by far the most robust option that we can take forward. In relation to early years, I've tried to be as clear as I possibly can do in the statement. We expect schools and nurseries, public state schools and nurseries to close for the ordinary learning activities that are undertaken, but of course the buildings may be used to provide support for vulnerable young people and for the children of key workers in the antivirus effort. In relation to the PVI sector, I can't direct that sector to close, but I'm asking them to follow the advice, which would mean they should close. But I'm encouraging local authorities to work closely with the PVI sector to identify how the children of key workers, for example, or the children of families with vulnerability could be supported in a different operating model within the PVI sector, if that is possible to be undertaken. Now, I recognise that that alone would not provide sustainability to the PVI sector, which is why I've set out our commitment to maintain the payments that are made, despite the fact that children won't be there, to the PVI sector to sustain income. And I've also set out some flexibility about the resources that are inherent in the 2020-21 budget to be deployed flexibly to try to provide sustainability. That is in addition to the measures that Fiona Hislop set out yesterday in relation to business support in general. So I hope out of all of that we are able to support actively the PVI sector, but the Early Years Minister is at my side and she will be actively engaging with the sector to ensure that we understand their difficulties and challenges. On his second point in relation to key workers, I would encourage any individual who has a contribution, a critical contribution to make to our economy, to first talk to their school or early learning setting to identify if they can be provided with some support to ensure their children can be educated or cared for in this period. That will be the first point of call, and obviously local authorities will be supporting that effort. Finally, in relation to the exam diet, the Chief Examiner, I've set out in my statement the Chief Examiner's current thinking that the coursework that young people are ordinarily required to contribute for their exams, along with assessments by teachers of the expected performance of young people, which again is material which should be submitted to the SQA on an annual basis, combined with prior attainment, which is particularly relevant to higher candidates, will be used as part of that assessment, and further details will be set out by the Chief Examiner of the approach that will be taken. In terms of the dates of awards, the Chief Examiner is working on the basis that the awards will still be made at the latest on the 4th of August 2020, which enables young people to secure eligibility for university entrance. It may well be that the results can be posted at an earlier stage. If that is the case, then we will try to do so, but we will be aiming to achieve that on the 4th of August.
Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We supported the Cabinet Secretary in the difficult decision he took to keep schools and nurseries open when many thought they should be closed. That was right, and we support him now in the equally difficult decision to close them, now that it's right to do so. And I also want to echo his tribute to teachers and other school and nursery workers who have kept our education establishments open in difficult times. Many pupils have already been provided with study packs and access to online teaching resources. And this will perhaps be critical given the decision about the exam diet and the importance of coursework. But this varies from school to school and even from teacher to teacher. Surely there is a role here for Education Scotland in providing some consistency of curriculum and learning opportunity nationally. What is Education Scotland's role in this crisis? Secondly, with regard to key workers, I hear what the Cabinet Secretary and indeed the First Minister earlier said about flexibility of definition. But there is widespread confusion. Surely there is a case, at least for a core list. Will it include supermarket workers, for example? And finally, in the welcome agreement to continue public funding for private and independent nurseries, what assurances has the Cabinet Secretary sought and has he received from the sector regarding commensurate protection of employment and pay for those working in those establishments?
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Gray for his comments of support to the difficult decisions that we've made, and also his tribute to teachers and all the workers in the education system, because these have been very challenging days for them, given the level of anxiety and the fact that we have actually managed to sustain educational provision to the extent that we have, where today we have only 16 schools out of 2,500 currently closed, is a significant tribute to the efforts of those individuals. In relation to his questions, Education Scotland are fully involved in supporting individual schools and local authorities in the continuation of educational provision, and indeed in the letter that is probably now been issued to local authorities on my behalf, I have set out the support that's available from Education Scotland at local level, and it is important that they provide that support to individual schools and local authorities for this to be effective. In relation to Mr Gray's point on key workers, there is a very careful balance that's got to be struck here, and I tried to do that in as much detail as I could in my statement, because there will be different challenges and requirements in different parts of the country. There will be a universal requirement for healthcare workers to be involved in that because of the nature of the challenges that we face. But it's important that we provide sufficient flexibility for local communities to be able to take decisions that will enable individuals to make their contribution to the efforts that we need to be undertaken. So local authorities have asked us for that degree of flexibility. We are working actively to make sure that is clearly understood at local level to maximise the number of individuals that can be supported to make a contribution to the efforts that we need them to contribute to.
Now, I have an inordinate amount of questions here, and I don't think we're going to get through them all. Could I suggest that if people feel their questions been answered by a previous questioner, that they withdraw? That may help, and if people could please be as short as possible in their questions. And I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and the commitment regarding the funding to deliver government commitments from the private sector. But can I ask a bit more detail about what advice will be given where people are being asked to change their practices? We don't want to move the risk that's associated with keeping the schools open into a different building or area in the community. So what advice will be given to private nurseries, after-school clubs and childminders who may be expanding or changing their model of working from today? And also, what, if any, impact will there be on parents who enter into pooling arrangements regarding childcare with regards to regulations such as disclosure or child protection?
John Swinney.
I think one of the key points that has to be observed in all of these questions and all of the issues that Claire Adamson raises is the general health advice that has been issued and was put in place on Monday. And the First Minister went through in detail at First Minister's question time a couple of hours ago the components of that advice. And I would simply reinforce that point, that in all settings, in all circumstances, that general health advice must be followed, because that is critical in enabling us to overcome the coronavirus outbreak. In relation to any individual settings, that there has to be careful account of the health advice undertaken by anybody operating, whether that's a head teacher in a school or whether that's a childminder in their own home. And obviously, in relation to the last point that Claire Adamson made of parents providing childminder facilities for a number of children, that would have to be very carefully considered by individual families because of the health advice that is generally available on this question.
A little change in what I said. I'm going to have Willie Rennie, followed by Ross Greer.
I want to thank the Education Secretary for an advance sight of his statement, especially as he prepared this statement during very difficult personal circumstances himself. With a 15-year-old son who is preparing for his Nat5s right now, I do have a bit of a window into the practical as well as the emotional issues that are at play here. But I want to press the Education Secretary a little bit further on the key workers, because I think this is important. Is it going to be a case that there's going to be a bit of self-declaration within this, or will line managers and employers have a role in that, or will the councils make the designation if the designation is not going to be made on a central basis? And then quickly on nurseries, it's talked about flexibility in regards to the regulations. Does that mean we're changing the nursery teacher pupil ratios, and is there any limit on that change if that's the case?
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Rennie for his remarks. On the first point in relation to key workers, essentially we must be able to leave room for local flexibility in establishing what will be key skills that are required in individual localities around the country. But we've also got to balance that against creating a list of key tasks that essentially doesn't in any way narrow down those who might be eligible. Because that fits into the second point that Mr Rennie raised with me, which is that there will be limited provision available within the education and early learning system for children to be accommodated, because if we don't have limited provision, we defeat the object of closing schools and nurseries. So there's a very fine balance to be established here, and what must be the controlling influence in that judgment is the opinion of the scientific opinion about what will actually help to tackle the virus and what would hinder tackling the virus. So Mr Rennie shouldn't think that there's going to be a dramatic change to the operating model to somehow enable more children to be accommodated. It will be actually quite the reverse.
Ross Greer, followed by Stewart McMillan.
Thank you. Like colleagues, I thank the Deputy First Minister for his work. I appreciate the work that councils are doing looking at cash and voucher systems and collection points for free school meal provision, but I want to emphasise the need for home delivery capacity. Whether it's chaotic households where barriers to feeding children are more than just financial, restricted access to shops without public transport, the need for self-isolation, or the stigma of having to go and collect a meal or other factors, a direct delivery provision will be essential for some children and families. Does the Deputy First Minister agree with that, and will the Scottish Government work with councils and others to ensure that is available?
John Swinney.
I think it's very much the approach we've taken, and this has been welcomed by local authorities, has been to give the maximum amount of flexibility to local authorities to determine what will work. And Mr Greer raises absolutely fair points about the necessity of ensuring that food actually gets to young people. It's one of the biggest issues that I have worried about this whole decision, is about how young people who it's not a word of exaggeration, school is in some cases the only place they get a decent meal. And we have to make sure that that is maintained for the well-being of children and young people. So the option that Mr Greer puts forward is one that I know local authorities are exploring. There is no barrier to them pursuing that from the government's approach or the steps that we're taking. And I would certainly use this opportunity to encourage local authorities to consider the suggestions that Mr Greer has made.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the significant impact that home learning can have on parents and also guardians. So can he provide some further assurances on what support will actually be made available to them?
John Swinney.
There's a variety of support that will be available from individual schools. Yesterday morning, before the Government made clear that we were intending to close schools, my wife and I received an email from my son's school advising us of further details about access to home learning materials in case the schools were going to be closed, and I know that's been replicated around the country. So those mechanisms will be available. Of course, some young people won't have access to digital materials, and schools must understand that and ensure that young people have access to such materials. There's also some very good advice that's available through Parent Club, which is available online. It's a superb resource which gives good, practical and constructive advice to parents about home learning and other aspects of supporting children, and I would encourage them to use that resource.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary and others will join with me in welcoming the many offers made on social media by current and former teachers to provide advice and support to parents who are helping educate their children at home through this. I was just wondering if you could also outline the role online learning will play and where additional support might be needed to facilitate that, and also whether organisations like the Open University and other remote learning providers will be utilised.
John Swinney.
I very much welcome the offers that have been made by various members of the teaching profession. Obviously, we're in a completely different position in handling such an event compared to where we would have been 10 or 20 years ago because of digital connectivity. So we have very extensive connectivity within our country. It's not universal, but it is very, very extensive. And there are a whole range of digital learning supports that are available, alongside the very direct support which will be available from individual schools. But if that's reinforced by other providers, other sources of learning material, and also by teachers who are living in communities to support young people, that will be very welcome. There will, of course, be active participation in learning by teachers who remain well throughout, but who can sit at their own keyboards. And, again, in my own personal experience, we see material coming through at all times of the evening and the early morning from teaching staff to advise us of mechanisms. That's obviously been done from teachers' homes, and there's the opportunity to pursue that in the period going forward. And I know there'll be many, many, many members of the teaching profession committed to doing exactly that.
Monica Lennon, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you. Our schools are really good at supporting young people who are transitioning from primary to secondary, and we'll have lots of primary sevens tomorrow wondering if that's the last time they'll walk through those particular school gates. So can the Cabinet Secretary advise, it's probably emotional for some of the members in the room, can the Cabinet Secretary advise what support will be in place for those young people and their families? And can I also ask, in terms of the brilliant access we have to free period products in our school estate, what will be in place to ensure that young people can access those products?
John Swinney.
The point on transitioning is a really, really significant point, and our schools have done a superb job in changing the ways in which we support young people to move from primary to second, to make that as seamless as possible. And it's one of those issues we're going to have to get round with. I'm sure Monica Lennon will understand that I'm not quite thinking about the end of June quite yet. I have barely got to the end of Thursday before I get to the end of June. So we've got to think carefully about that dialogue with local authorities, because we cannot have young people missing out on the really precious experience of leaving their primary school, celebrating all of that, and then being able to move seamlessly into secondary school. So if Monica Lennon will forgive me, I'm actually going to say that to her on both of our questions, we are going to have to get round to thinking through the issues of transition. In relation to the free period products, obviously this issue illustrates the pivotal role our schools play in our society. It's a perfect example of how our schools do more than just deliver education. So, as part of the approach which I know our local authorities are focused on ensuring the well-being of young people, I will ensure that these issues are reflected in those priorities.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Emma Harper.
Following on from Monica Lennon's point around transitions, and I declare my interest as a parent of a child with additional support needs who is moving from P7 to S1. For those children with complex additional needs, that transition process is often quite long and needs to be handled very carefully to enable acclimatisation to a new school environment, a new school timetable and a new way of working. My son had his first transition meeting at school quite recently, but that process has now been put into limbo. Will the Cabinet Secretary consider, and I appreciate it's a longer-term consideration, whether there might be the possibility that flexibility at the start of the coming educational year might be required for those pupils who required a longer lead-in for transition than perhaps mainstream P7 pupils would require?
John Swinney.
Before I answer the specific point that Mark MacDonald has raised, let me just place on record my acknowledgement of the significance of the disruption that the school closure will be to pupils with additional support needs in general. I saw this when I was dealing over the summer with the issues at St Ambrose High School in Coatbridge and the associated secondary school that provides education for young people with additional support needs. And the young people were disorientated by the loss of their school as an anchor in their educational experience. So we have to be mindful of that. I will certainly give consideration as I look at the transition issues to the specific point that Mark MacDonald has raised to ensure that we minimise the disruption to young people and that we maximise the opportunities they have to take forward the continuity of education that is so important to young people with additional support needs.
Emma Harper, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
The Cabinet Secretary will be aware and has already mentioned that many pupils will be feeling very anxious during this time, which could have an impact on their mental health. Can he provide assurances of what support will be available to support young people in their mental health?
John Swinney.
We are in a very, very difficult place as a country because people in general are going to have less social contact and less opportunity to access the services and support of others as a consequence of the advice that we are all having to follow. And it's important that within our communities we do everything we can to support individuals, and particularly in relation to the young people that I've cited and their anxiety about the examination process or the changes that I've announced today, that we give them access where it is safe and practical to do so to the support mechanisms that are available around our schools. Our schools are very broad and diverse communities. They provide a range of services to young people, and where it is safe to do so, we should ensure that young people have access to these services, but we must always be mindful of the health advice in this respect.
Michelle Ballantyne, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Many of the workers in the early learning PVI sector will also be parents, and they may also be self-isolating or off sick for other reasons. Has the Cabinet Minister given any thought to how the flex between the state sector workers who are going to be off if their settings are closed, whether they can be allowed to go and work in the PVI sector to backfill? And another very quick one. Those children who don't pull their socks up to the last minute on their exams, will they get a chance to resit?
John Swinney.
I have to say to Michelle Ballantyne, she has sometimes a beautiful turn of phrase. I see Edward Mountain is confessing that he's one of those. I would simply encourage him to keep on trying harder. In all seriousness, it is a very significant issue that Michelle Ballantyne has raised, and the Chief Examiner will be mindful of all of these questions as she considers the approach to take. And it's important that in all of our judgments that we take, we are giving due consideration to whether or not young people are being given a fair opportunity to have their work and their contribution assessed. And if we don't judge that to be the case, then we must find other ways of ensuring that young people are able to progress in their learning. But I will relay that particular point to the Chief Examiner. On the first point that Michelle Ballantyne raised about the sustainability of the PVI sector, I hope I said enough in my statement about the government's keenness and enthusiasm to make sure we do all that we can do to sustain the PVI sector through what I acknowledge is going to be a really difficult period for them. Michelle Ballantyne has made a suggestion about how that might be made practical and possible. We'll add that into the discussions, and the Early Years Minister will be able to take that forward in the dialogue that will happen with local authorities.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Joanne Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, with so many teaching and ancillary staff likely to be at home probably for some months, what steps are being taken to maintain the skills of those staff? And is the Scottish Government examining how staff can be potentially redeployed to help their communities in the current crisis meantime?
Presiding Officer,
John Swinney.
I thought it was interesting that last night I saw the Director of Education of the City of Glasgow Council being interviewed on television talking about how they had invited offers of volunteering from members of the teaching staff, and they had had an overwhelming response from members of the teaching staff. So I think members of the teaching profession, where they're able to do so, because some of them will not be well, some of them will have commitments that make it impossible for them to contribute. But I think where that's possible, I'm certain that members of the teaching staff will make that contribution to our wider community. And in relation to professional development, one of the things that we're always wrestling with in the education system is finding enough time for teachers to be able to take forward professional development. Well, there's certainly going to be a bit more time available in the weeks going ahead. And there's plenty of digital learning opportunities in which professional development can be taken forward. So there will obviously be, once we get the model stabilised and operating, I'm quite certain there will be an appetite amongst members of staff to continue to develop their professional practice, for which, of course, they can achieve accreditation with the General Teaching Council of Scotland.
Joanne Lamont, followed by Alex Neil.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of my grave concern about this decision, and I know that he will have taken it in the best of faith and with real seriousness. But I have to confess that I am very troubled and very upset about what I fear are the long-term and serious consequences for the life chances and opportunities for some of our young people. And it's not just a digital divide, but there are all sorts of other inequalities that will be, I fear, reinforced over this period. So I can ask that he confirms he will be keeping this under the closest review, and that in the medium term at least will be planning for when this is over to address those consequences. And specifically can ask the Cabinet Secretary whether, like me, he recognise that it is individual schools which matter to individual families, and will he confirm the benefits of keeping open as many local schools as possible, as they are seen as a source of advice and support to many families, support that they can trust? And will he confirm what he believes to be the responsibility of individual schools to communicate directly and regularly with all of the families for whom they have a responsibility?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I recognise the strength of feeling that Joanne Lamont has on this question, and I think she knows how difficult a decision it will have been for me to take this particular decision. Joanne Lamont also knows of the policy commitment of the government to work to close the poverty-related attainment gap. And that is my policy focus today. It will be my policy focus at the end of this particular crisis. It will be my policy focus to try to protect that as much as to protect the focus on that policy throughout the handling of this crisis, because I want to see no damage done to the life chances of any young person in Scotland, particularly those who come from the most deprived backgrounds. So we will be working very hard to make sure that we sustain educational provision as effectively as we possibly can do. I think there is an argument for schools in a more limited way to be able to provide the support that Joanne Lamont has talked about in their localities, and we've left sufficient flexibility in the approach that we've taken to enable that to be taken forward at local level. I think it's really important that individual schools communicate with individual families. They know their people, they know who they are, and they must support them as effectively as they possibly can do. And we will be creating the assistance and the support and delivering the flexibility to enable that to be the case.
Alex Neil, followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I particularly welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to set aside £220 million for the PDI sector, because it's extremely important that we maintain that capacity for the longer-term expansion of early years and nursery education. However, can I ask him to give a commitment that the payments will be made timiously, indeed urgently, and will he consider sending those payments directly to the individual schools rather than through the local authorities, because that could involve unnecessary delay?
John Swinney.
I'll explore that point, but my judgment is that the existing payment channels that are being made will be made through local authorities, and it may actually end up slowing it up if we were then to do it on their behalf. But I will stress the point of the urgency of the point that is made by Mr Neil. And there actually is no good reason for there to be any delay, because the money is there, it's in the system, it's committed, it should be able to be distributed. So I will endeavour to make sure that those payments are made timiously, because to address the very significant point that Mr Neil makes.
Edward Mountain, followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, these are indeed exceptional times, and I want to briefly touch on the exceptional support given to vulnerable and ASN pupils in the Highlands, which is held in such high regard. School closures have caused some concern among these pupil groups and their parents. You have indicated what you intend to do, but could you perhaps shed a bit more light on what support you would like to see given to these pupils and their families during this time?
John Swinney.
I think some of the additional support needs provision should be able to operate in a fairly consistent manner to its existing model, as long as it is compliant with or consistent with the health advice that is being issued. So I think there should be the ability, and you know, going back to the answers I gave to Martin MacDonald and to Ross Greer about additional support needs pupils, I recognise how this is disruptive for everybody. It's very, very disruptive to young people with additional support needs. So we have to make sure that we do everything we can to try to minimise that disruption. So I think those opportunities exist, and obviously we'll be encouraging local authorities, as I have done in my statement today, to try to maintain as much continuity as they possibly can do.
Lewis MacDonald, followed by Andy Whiteman.
Given, as he has said, that we will need our teachers going forward more than ever, will the Cabinet Secretary talk to the General Teaching Council Scotland about the requirement for probationary teachers to complete a full school year in order to achieve full registration and join the teaching workforce permanently in the autumn? And in the meantime, will he ensure that probationary teachers will continue to be employed and paid?
John Swinney.
There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be the case, but I don't have the answer at the front of my head, so I'll check it for Mr MacDonald and I'll write to him afterwards. Certainly, those probationary teachers should be paid. There's no way that somebody should suffer disadvantage of that type. In relation to the regulatory requirements, I'm probably trespassing onto territory I shouldn't trespass onto, but let me just say that I think it would be unreasonable for the General Teaching Council not to accredit probationary teachers with a full year of contribution, because through no fault of their own, their opportunity has been uninterrupted at this stage. Indeed, I saw the other day that the General Teaching Council and the Scottish Council of Deans of Education on Monday withdrew placement teachers who are out in placement and judged that they would be, provided they had achieved the necessary standard, they would be judged to have completed their placement activity, although it had been concluded early. So I think the logic of that decision is that probationary teachers should be able to be confident that this year has been secured. But I will confirm that in writing.
I have decided to allow these questions to run until 3:10, no later. That will be Andy Whiteman, followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the quality of prelims varies hugely from school to school and from subject to subject. His statement refers to coursework, teacher assessment of estimated grades and prior attainment being used. So 2 questions. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that no pupil will be disadvantaged because of such variation, and that there will be some form of quality assurance put in place? And secondly, can he also confirm that any difficulties faced by pupils in submitting coursework due to home or family circumstances will be taken into account?
John Swinney.
The issue of quality assurance will have to be an implicit part of the alternative certification model, and the Chief Examiner is exploring all of those questions as she develops the process, which will give us a diet about which we can be confident. And that was the standard that I asked to be tested against, and I have been given the assurance that that is possible to be done, but it will require quality assurance to be put in place. The second issue is an important issue which we need to make sure is tackled in a way that recognises the contribution that young people have made. There may be issues of performance which have to be taken properly into account in the assessment of the work that young people have completed in terms of coursework. And there must obviously be mechanisms in place for young people to be able to question the results that have emerged as a result of this process, as there is in any exam diet that we take forward. And further details on that will be issued in due course.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I declare an interest in that I am married to a primary school teacher? Provision for key workers will need to continue throughout Easter holidays and very probably the summer holidays as well. How will we provide both teachers and pupils with a degree of a break in that time? And how will it be decided which teachers will provide cover in person?
John Swinney.
Fundamentally, I think this can only work if we deploy flexibility at local level. If I sit in St Andrew's House trying to decide exactly how this is going to work across the geography of Scotland, I'm afraid, I'm confident I won't get that all right. So we have to put that down to local level to enable those judgments to be arrived at. And the very genuine questions that Mr Cole-Hamilton raises, I'm quite sure can be considered as part of that process.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary Bailey Lee Robb, who is the member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Cowdenbeath constituency, at his own initiative posted a video clip at lunchtime today seeking to reassure his fellow young people at schools across Fife. This seems to me to be an excellent initiative, and I just wonder what the Cabinet Secretary can do to encourage more such initiatives so that we can see this much-needed reassurance to young people provided across Scotland.
John Swinney.
I think that's a very, very welcome example of how young people at a peer group level can reassure each other. We spend a great deal of our time working with organisations like Young Scot to exercise that reassurance around the country, to provide trusted, safe encouragement to young people. And we certainly will continue to do so. Some very good material broadcast as a consequence of the partnership between Young Scot and the government, which involved Professor Jason Leach the other day in terms of the coronavirus. So there's a whole host of opportunities to do that, and I'll certainly take forward the suggestions that Annabel Ewing has made.
Jeremy Balfour, followed by Neil Finlay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary. Following on from Alex Cole-Hamilton's question, and I do appreciate that this cannot be run from Edinburgh, but with the schools closing tomorrow afternoon, there will be parents who don't have access to email or other ways of communicating. And if the school is closed, what advice can we give to local authorities of keeping parents in touch who don't have access to the devices that many of us do have? Because there will be questions that come up over the next few weeks and months that people may want answered. And as you appreciate, phoning the local authority to get them to the right person can often be very difficult.
John Swinney.
I think it's absolutely vital that schools know the young people and their families that are part of their schools, and that they have reliable and trusted means of communicating with all of those individuals. For some, that may be ordinarily straightforward through digital communication. For others, it may require personal calls or telephone calls or written communication. And I would encourage all schools to maintain that dialogue, to reach individual young people and families, and to make sure they can have access to the information and the support that they require.
Neil Finlay, followed by Graham Simpson.
if we're going to get through this successfully, then we're going to need key workers to continue to be at work. Currently, we're relying on people suspected of having a highly infectious disease to self-diagnose. I wonder if the government is looking at how the Irish government is doing this, where they have set up testing centres that people can be referred by their GP through the testing centre and be diagnosed very quickly, so that we can ensure that key workers like teachers, health professionals can get back to work.
John Swinney.
I think Mr Finlay makes an important point, and I think the commitments that the First Minister gave at question time today, which I know have been set out in more detail by the Health Secretary, I think address fundamentally the points that Mr Finlay is making. It's really important that we understand the path and the pattern of the virus to enable us to take all of the necessary action. That's what's led us to the decision that we've taken, the very difficult decision to close schools. But I think the issue that Mr Finlay raises is important, but it's been taken forward by the priorities of the Government.
Graham Simpson, followed by Anna Sarwar.
Thank you. I asked the Cabinet Secretary the other day about what we were going to do for final year university students, and I'll ask him again. His answer to me at that time was, well, it's up to the universities. That's true, but thousands of these students still don't know whether they can sit their exams and how they're going to graduate. So could I urge the Cabinet Secretary to speak to the university sector to make sure that those students get the information they need in the next few days?
John Swinney.
I think I'm glad that Mr Simpson acknowledges that what I said to him the other day was true, because it is. And if I start specifying to universities the means by which they should assess their degrees, I think we're in an altogether different world altogether. I see a Member of Parliament who's remotely connected to a university not far from Mr Simpson nodding that I might be in the right space on that answer. So that's encouraging, to say the least. The Higher Education Minister has been in dialogue with the principals of universities and colleges. There are a variety of different methods being taken by individual universities to ensure students can complete their courses. Some of them are by online certification, and that communication has been undertaken directly by individual institutions. But since Mr Simpson has raised the point so emphatically with me on 2 occasions this week, I will make sure that Mr Lockhead reiterates that to the universities to address those issues.
Anna Sarwar.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Deputy First Minister for his statement. This is about creating safety for the pupils, their teachers, but also their families that might be coming into contact with those children and teachers. You've mentioned quite rightly around the key workers. What consideration have been made about those key workers that aren't in the public sector, for example, care workers that work for third sector organisations, and support that will come into them, especially if they have caring responsibilities?
John Swinney.
That's one of the reasons why we are not being as prescriptive as some may like us to be about the definition of key workers, because that may well be a more significant consideration in one part of the country than in another. So I hope the definition that we are working with our local authority partners to work within gives that necessary flexibility, but enables us to provide the support and the assistance that is required in all circumstances.
You can squeeze in the last very quick question from Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Deputy First Minister for his leadership on this issue. I wanted to raise quickly an issue that's actually just been raised with me. Do you think there will be any consideration of special circumstances for students that may have experienced an illness or circumstances out with their control in the earlier part of the school year? Is this something you think Cabinet Secretary, the Chief Examiner, might take into account?
Quickly, please, John Swinney.
There's always provision for the individual circumstances of pupils to be taken into account by the Scottish Qualifications Authority. We've also had a couple of examples where we've had schools that have been affected by fires in the course of the last year. Woodmill High School in Dunfermline, Peebles High School in the Borders, where young people, where there's specific discussions with the SQA about making sure that those young people are not in any way disadvantaged by the incidents that have taken place.
Thank you. That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's statement on education. We'll move on to the next item of business as quickly as possible, please. The next item of business is a statement by Michael Russell on UK coronavirus legislation. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Michael Russell for 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, can I start by echoing the words and sentiments of the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport earlier this week? We are, as a country and across the globe, facing an unprecedented set of challenges. None of us have experienced those challenges before. We can only meet and defeat them if we work collectively to protect, sustain, support, nurture and help each other. Addressing these challenges will mean change, profound and sometimes difficult change for us all. Every life will change. Nothing will be and can be the same from now on. But we need to change with hope in our hearts. We need to change with a determination to look after ourselves, our loved ones, our communities and our future. The First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, the Deputy First Minister and other Cabinet Secretaries have already outlined to this Chamber the steps that are being taken. Today I want to talk about the necessary legislative changes we need to bring about quickly in order for our nation to change and respond in the most effective manner. The first tranche of these comes in the UK Coronavirus Bill, for which the Scottish Government will recommend granting legislative consent. The Four Nations Coronavirus Action Plan, published earlier this month, set out measures to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak and information on the four-stage strategy: contain, delay, research and mitigate. The Action Plan outlines a collective approach, reflecting the closely indicated planning process established to help prevent the spread of the outbreak and combat the impact and consequences of it. This includes reference to legislation that might be necessary in order to ensure that public bodies across the UK have the tools and the powers they need to carry out an effective response. The bill introduced today at Westminster underpins the Action Plan. It is the result of a great deal of intensive work between the UK Government and the devolved administrations, unique and extraordinary given the virtual standoff on other legislation that has been the norm for the past 3 years. And it's required because of the extraordinary public health and economic challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic. We're grateful to everyone who has been part of that process, and particularly the officials across all the governments and many departments who have worked tirelessly to make sure the bill is now available for scrutiny and passage. Of course, the Scottish Government has made clear that, while we acknowledge the benefits of alignment across all four UK nations, it is also important that devolved matters can be fully analysed and considered against the emerging situation here in Scotland and the specific measures and action that we and others need to put in place to respond to that. It's good to know that that position has been respected, just as we have respected the need for specific measures and actions in the other three nations of the UK. Presiding Officer, it is clear that this bill cannot be scrutinised in the way we would all normally wish. The immediacy of the unprecedented challenge that Scotland and the UK faces at this time do not permit that. However, we must also be conscious of the fact that with any legislative urgency, no matter how extreme, must also come a parallel and urgent recognition of the concomitant need to be vigilant in the protection of human rights, particularly of those who are least able to protect themselves. I hope that those at Westminster and more widely who are rightly concerned that, for example, the 2-year sunset period for this bill needs to be looked at very carefully and safeguards put in place for regular reporting, review and renewal if required will be heeded in their concerned and constructive criticism. The intention here is for a legislative consent memorandum to be considered at committee on Tuesday morning and for a motion to be debated by this chamber on Tuesday afternoon, subject, of course, to the Parliament's agreement. The legislative consent motion does not require renewal, nor is there a statutory reporting function for this Parliament and the Scottish Government in the legislation, though there is for the UK Government. However, I want to make a commitment here today that we will institute, after discussion across the Parliament, appropriate reporting on how and when the powers in the bill have been used by the Scottish Government. And in our own further emergency coronavirus legislation, which we hope to bring forward to put other urgent legislative changes specifically for our own competencies on the statute book, hopefully before Easter, we will embed such reporting and renewal, including on our use of provisions in this bill, into law. Presiding Officer, the measures in the bill cover a range of topics and sectors and include bespoke provisions for Scotland to reflect our different legal systems in devolved areas. Combined with measures already being taken by the Scottish Government and our partners, they will help in assuring our health and social care services remain effectively resourced, protect people and assist in slowing down the spread of coronavirus. There is one very important point I want to stress here, and on which I anticipate that assurances will be sought as the bill undertakes its passage across the UK and devolved parliaments. This is that creating these additional powers does not automatically mean we will be required to use them, or that all of the powers available to us will be implemented at the same time as the bill gains royal assent. We of course recognise the immense seriousness of the current situation and the further risks we now face if, as the scientific advice indicates, we are now on the cusp of a rapid escalation in the spread of the virus. The next few weeks and possibly months will be a uniquely difficult time, when the people of Scotland will be asked to take unprecedented action as part of our collective efforts to protect our citizens and, as the First Minister said, to save lives. In using the powers we have and will gain, we will always be guided by the principle that decisions will be taken at the appropriate time on actions and measures to be taken based on the situation here in Scotland and other parts of the UK. Moreover, we will use those powers in the appropriate way, informed always by our own response planning and by ongoing joint work with the UK Government and other devolved governments. Presiding Officer, let me briefly outline some of the measures in the bill in a little more detail, though there is a great deal of detail in the bill. The areas of action in the bill can be broadly categorised as, firstly, additional public health measures to assist with containment or to mitigate the spread of the disease, including powers relating to events and the ability to effect screening for potentially infected persons. Measures to allow for increased numbers of health and social care workers to join the workforce, for example, by removing barriers to allow recently retired NHS staff and social workers to return to work. Here in Scotland, in addition to retired persons, this will also include those who are on a career break or are social work students who can become temporary social workers. The relaxation of certain regulatory requirements within existing legislation in order to ease the burden on staff who are in the front line of our response, enable reduction in emergency tasks and the prioritisation of care towards those with the most significant and urgent needs. Measures to ensure management of deceased persons with respect and dignity in acknowledgement that we have already seen tragic loss of life due to this pandemic. And provisions to support the economy, including issues around statutory sick pay, which are aimed at ensuring that coronavirus impact on small businesses and individuals is lessened. The bill contains a range of powers that can enhance our response and ensure that action taken can be enforced. One example is on the powers within the bill to require information to be provided by those within or closely connected to a food supply chain, where a failure to comply with a request or to provide false or misleading information will attract a financial penalty. But of course, a route of appeal is also set out in the legislation for many of the enforcement actions. Presiding Officer, the bill contains a range of other items of importance, and the accompanying information from the UK Government is now available online. I'd be happy to talk to my opposite numbers in other parties about the detail, and I have suggested that we get together by phone later tonight or tomorrow in order for us to do so. I'm also happy to inform other members of the Chamber if they have questions. Presiding Officer, I've used the word unprecedented several times in this, but of course that is in our time. It is not in all time before us. As a nation and as a generation and as a civilization, we have been here before. The experience of pandemics is not a modern one, but a very ancient one. Again and again, humanity has had to face this challenge. It's been recorded and commented on by countless individuals. It's led to great reflections on what it is to be human and to be part of a society under threat. And the common thread in all of those works has been not just fear and worry for oneself and one's loved ones. It's also been a thread of community solidarity, concern for all of those around us, generosity of spirit and action, and hope for the future. It is a thread that emphasises a shared belief in human creativity, ingenuity, and survival. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Asked Bertolt Brecht just before the Second World War. And he answered himself by saying, yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. On the wall outside this Parliament, there's a quote from Fletcher of Saltoun about the relationship between the songs of a country and its laws. We are going to need both to see us through. I reluctantly leave the singing to others, but as to the laws, I will do all I can, with my colleagues and with this chamber, to put in place what we need to get through. We must do the right thing for everyone, We must take action to protect, to enhance and to strengthen not just our response, but ourselves. As part of this effort, I look forward to engaging further with colleagues across this chamber in the coming days on this vitally important piece of legislation and further legislation we will require to bring. Let me finish, as I started, with the sentiments expressed by the First Minister. We should all thank the people of Scotland now and going forward for all of their effort, concern and understanding. It will still be needed in the weeks ahead, but together we can and we will win through.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I will allow around 20 minutes for that. It would be helpful if those who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons, and I first of all call Myrtle Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and also for advance sight of it. We are dealing, as he said, with an unprecedented set of challenges, and that requires an unprecedented approach. Can I warmly welcome all he had to say about the level of engagement there has been between the Scottish Government and the UK Government and the other devolved administrations, and join with him in thanking all those involved in a process which has required very rapid and diligent action. And can I pledge the support of the Scottish Conservatives to the proposed legislation and our cooperation in taking it through Parliament as expeditiously as possible in these circumstances. In normal times, there would be concerns about the human rights aspects of some of what is proposed. But we are not in normal times. We are dealing with a crisis, and this requires a different approach, where we accept that some freedoms will have to be curtailed, albeit in a measured and a time-limited fashion. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary two questions on his statement? Firstly, by what date does he expect the legislation to be enacted, should it complete its parliamentary passage at Westminster? And secondly, the Cabinet Secretary referred to further emergency coronavirus legislation to be passed here. Can he say more about what that legislation is likely to cover?
Michael Russell.
Well, can I thank Murdo Fraser for his remarks and for the indication, the support that he and his party will give. I'm very grateful for it, and we will need to work closely together. And I repeat the offer that if I can offer more information to Mr Fraser on the phone. We don't often talk on the phone, but I'm sure we could find a way of doing so this weekend to talk to the detail. And I would stress the detail that does exist. This is a complex bill. It is a bill that covers all the four nations of the UK, and there is much in it that we need to absorb. On his 3 points that I want to respond to. First, on the human rights aspect, I appreciate what he says. But as I indicated in my statement, we have to balance that, the requirement to act with urgency, with a continued concern for human rights. And I had a conversation at lunchtime with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, with the Chair and with certain of their staff, and I'm committed to speaking to them again as we develop our own legislation. And I have indicated that I want to make sure that we put in place a reporting function here, which is not in the bill, but which we need to do so that we are accountable to this chamber, and also indicated that I have sympathy with those who wish to query the situation presently of the 2 years. And I think it is possible to envisage a different set of processes that might go into place. In terms of the date and the urgency, it is likely that the House of Commons will consider this on Monday, and this is still unconfirmed completely. We would intend to finish our entire process on Tuesday, as I've indicated, first by committee appearance on Tuesday morning and then by Chamber on Tuesday afternoon, subject, of course, to the Parliamentary Bureau accepting that. It is likely, I believe, that the House of Lords will consider the bill on Wednesday and Thursday, though that, again, is not confirmed, and the bill should then have royal assent by the 31st. So the bill will then be in effect. Though there is commencement for some items in the bill on the 31st, there is therefore the need for regulation on other items. There are some triggers in the bill which we would have to, for example, declare certain things to allow parts of the bill to take place. So that all needs to follow on. But our aim is to have it through on the 31st. Finally, in terms of our own legislation, and I know the First Minister has been very open with the Chamber, and I'm very happy to do that too. I circulated Cabinet Secretary colleagues this morning with a note which asked them to bring forward their proposals. We already knew of proposals from the Justice side, and I think Aileen Campbell indicated yesterday a requirement for a legislative change in terms of her own area. There may be others. I would aim to have the information on what Cabinet Secretaries require, for example, on ways of expending money and other things that may require legislative approval early next week. I would hope that we would be able to bring an emergency bill to this chamber, again, subject to the Bureau, and I know my colleague Graham Day will be speaking or has spoken to members of the Bureau about how this will work. I would aim to have that emergency legislation in the week before the Easter recess. That is a very urgent timetable, but of course it will require a lot of cooperation and a lot of discussion about what should be in that bill, and I'm committed to that discussion.
Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, these are indeed unprecedented times, and there is a need for the legislation that we are discussing today, but we should always be vigilant of protecting human rights, and that should remain our principal position. However, I do believe such legislation should be renewed every 6 months in order to be accountable to Parliament. I very much welcome what the Cabinet Secretary had to say and look forward to the further emergency legislation coming forward, in particular the fact that he says we will embed such reporting and renewal, including on our use of the provisions of the UK bill and law, I think is a very much welcomed statement. Can I ask, would he look at a 6-month rule in terms of bringing that back to Parliament? And finally, something that's not been mentioned, but there are those out there who are using this situation in order to cash in on a crisis. We've seen that with some charges, significant rises in prices for hand wash, for example, and some people buying up stock in order to cash in. Can this legislation, or the legislation he's looking to bring forward, protect those and certainly deal with those who are unscrupulous at this difficult time?
Michael Russell.
I welcome the very positive contribution from Alec Rowley, and I look forward to working with him on this. On the issue of human rights, I'm very open to considering in our own bill what the appropriate period is. Clearly, that has to relate to scrutiny, but also to the likely length of time in which we would need regulation. So I'm happy to look at it, but 6 months would seem to me probably the maximum period that one would go for. And there may be arguments to have reporting within. I think in terms of formal reporting on this bill, it has to be more regular than that. There is a commitment in the bill for the UK government to report every 2 months. I would have thought that given this Parliament's committee structure, we would want to make sure the committees were engaged in that as well. I mean, the focus of our work going forward, for certainly the foreseeable future in this chamber, will be on the issues of the coronavirus pandemic and how Scotland responds to it. And therefore, I think committees and this chamber will want to make sure that the work being done through this bill and other work is scrutinised, and there is the opportunity to discuss and debate it. The member raises an interesting point. I think that Kenny Gibson raised an issue about a particular product earlier in the week. I think all of us, our constituents, will be telling us about circumstances in which they are in which they're noticing price rises. There are some powers in the bill to do with the food supply chain and particularly to do with information. I suspect that they are limited. And I suspect that they could perhaps be used to get information, but not to do much more. There is the normal criminal law, but if there is a requirement to take additional powers for those circumstances, and we are able to do so, because of course certain powers such as trading and trading standards rely outside this Parliament, but if we have the power to do so, then be assured we will take them, because it is vitally important that people realise that we are a community and we need to treat each other with respect, and we do not profit from that.
Understandably, these first questions and answers have been lengthy, so if I could ask for brevity from now on, there's a lot of people who want to ask questions. Patrick Harvey, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the statement, and Greens will also be constructive in bringing what scrutiny is possible to this legislation over the coming days. But what struck me from an initial reading was not so much what's in the bill as what's not in the bill. There's nothing to mandate an increase in statutory sick pay, for example. The measures on compensation for emergency volunteers only cover loss of earnings, therefore ruling out those who've already lost their job from becoming emergency volunteers. And indeed, there's nothing beyond information provision on food supply that would allow public authorities to acquire stocks of food, household essentials or hygiene supplies in order to prevent price gouging. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that these changes would be welcome in the bill, and will he join us in urging the UK Government to consider them?
I certainly think that despite the shortness of notice, the debate at Westminster on Monday needs to be very comprehensive. These are precisely issues that need to be discussed. Where there is this, I suspect this is also the first piece of UK legislation, but not the last piece, and we will therefore also have our legislation. So in all those circumstances, I think there should be a vigorous debate about it. I'm personally sympathetic to the points that Patrick Harvey makes. If we can find a way to influence those at Westminster, fine. If we can find a way to do them ourselves, fine. I mean, I think the work that's been done together on this bill is hugely significant and very important, but we all have freedom of action within our own areas. That is protected within this bill. If we can do that, we will do it.
Willie Rennie, followed by Emma Harper.
I mean, I think these powers are inevitable in these extreme circumstances. Nevertheless, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will understand my nervousness that the powers will last for more than 2 years under Clause 76(2). Would the Cabinet Secretary consider it appropriate that we have parliamentary renewal perhaps after 90 days with another periodic renewal thereafter in order to keep public confidence? And the powers to enforce the health protection regulations requires to be made by affirmative procedure under Section 81. When would the Minister think it would be appropriate that that would be done?
Michael Russell.
On the second point, when those regulations come forward, and that will require a decision to be made, which requires to be scrutinised by this chamber on the trigger event, as the member will know from the bill, but that is the type of issue that we need to discuss. On the issue of 2 years, I've indicated I do think that requires very careful reconsideration by the House of Commons. We cannot alter that in terms of a legislative consent motion, and there is no procedure to renew a legislative consent motion. So what we have to do is to be imaginative in the use of powers. I've indicated that. The first piece of imagination in that is to make sure that when we bring our bill and any subsequent legislation, we are building in best practice. So it won't be 2 years. It has to be shorter than that. And the second issue is to voluntarily indicate that we will come back to this chamber to have scrutiny of everything we do under this bill, and when we can build that in as a legal requirement, as I hope we will be able to do in our next bill, then we make that retrospective. So we are doing so in terms of the provisions of this bill. I think that's the right way to take it forward.
Emma Harper, followed by Miles Briggs.
Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what engagement there has been with relevant stakeholders? He mentioned the Human Rights Commission in his response to Murdo Fraser earlier.
I was so surprised that we had a question that was short. Thank you very much, Ms Harper.
I hope I shall try a short answer. The work on this bill has been undertaken by officials up until essentially now, this week, and they have talked to the stakeholders with whom they normally deal. I have been involved in this bill for something like 48 hours, perhaps just slightly more, but I spoke today to the Human Rights Commission. I will be speaking to others. I wanted to speak to the Human Rights Commission, Scottish Human Rights Commission, particularly to express my concern and to hear their concerns about the bill, and to make sure that we could establish connections for the next piece of legislation so that we can try and get it into a position we'll all be more comfortable. There are, for example, and the member being a former nurse, indeed a current nurse, I know, will know that some of the mental health provisions in this bill are very concerning, and I think we need to be very alert to the issues that they raise. That's not to say they shouldn't happen, but we need to be alert to issues that they will raise for very vulnerable people.
Miles Briggs, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you. The measures brought forward around sick pay to be brought forward to 1 day are welcome. So can the Cabinet Secretary clarify whether Scottish patients will be able to obtain the so-called isolation note, and whether or not this will be through NHS 111 website or nhsinform.scot? And given the implications that the school closures are going to have on the pay sector, what conversations have taken place with payroll companies so they can carry on and get their staff to make sure that people are paid on time?
The member may forgive me, he has the expertise of being a health spokesperson. I do not. I will make sure he has an answer to those points, if there is an answer. I have to say this bill has changed quite a lot in the last 48 hours. So some of the sick pay provisions were not in it 2 days ago. In these circumstances, I suspect a lot of work is being done to work out how they will operate. But of course, we will try and secure that information so that people have it.
Monica Lennon, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. The emergency legislation that's been laid at Westminster removes the requirement on the need to carry out social care needs assessments. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether the intention behind that is only to remove bureaucratic processes, and can he give assurance that everyone who needs care will still be able to request it and access it, especially those who may be given early discharge from hospital?
The bill does not remove the obligation on local authorities to provide care. What it does is it removes the obligation to undertake a full assessment if that assessment cannot be taken in such a way that will expedite the delivery of social care. So it is, if there is a difficulty in the bureaucratic system, it reduces that. There is concern about that because some local authorities may have difficulty in getting assessments underway, but the bill is careful in how it does that. It needs to be examined closely at Westminster. If we have things we then need to do, this is a power that we have, we can then look at refining the process. We are aware of that, but it is important that we move it forward quickly.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In light of the ongoing concerns, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the Scottish Government and the UK Government will maintain regular ongoing dialogue to discuss whether and when each respective government plans to use the powers set forth in the bill?
Michael Russell.
As I understand it, the Secretary of State's reporting powers at Westminster on this will include a reporting that of items that we have undertaken and the other devolved governments have undertaken. I also intend to make sure there's reporting here. Given that we have got to this stage, and actually I am very heartened that we've got to this stage in terms of the content of this bill, which, as I've said in my statement, was far, far more integrated between the administrations than anything I've seen in the last 3.5 years, then we'll commit to continuing to work together to try and ensure that we know what each of us is doing.
Liam Kerr, followed by John May.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In relation to managing the deceased with respect and dignity, the bill intends to remove the need for a second confirmatory medical certificate for a cremation. Does the Cabinet Secretary have any thoughts on how appropriate safeguards can be put in place absent that second certificate?
Michael Russell.
It is a difficult issue. There are a number of procedures, ideas within this bill and proposals within this bill which will simplify the situation in terms of registration of death and change some of the obligations upon crematoria and local authorities. And there are obligations on crematoria and local authorities, for example, in the storage of ashes, which would require quite a lot of action in terms of tracing families, which could not be undertaken if there was pressure. What we really need to do is to make sure that any period of suspension, which is not automatic, any period of suspension is very short-lived indeed, and that we are aware of the difficulties it may cause in the area that Mr Kerr is indicating. There are other areas in the bill where we would look for as short a period as possible because there would be a removal of a second or confirmatory signature. There is a process of review of death certificates, which take the random process, which is undertaken, which the pressure, if there was pressure on staff, we would not be able to undertake. But we would want to make sure there was still some random checking, which is a very important safeguard. So how we apply this, the delicacy with which we apply it, is quite important. Some of the bill contains, for example, in the educational areas relating to the Deputy First Minister, very precise targeting powers. So in actual fact, you can target it right down to individual establishments. And we need to make sure we can do that as carefully as possible.
John Mason, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary has been stressing the integrated nature of the bill between the four countries. Can you say anything about, will, for example, commencement all happen at the same time across the four countries? What about suspension? What about use of the powers?
Where the powers lie in devolved competence, and the bill is quite clear about that, where the powers lie in devolved competence, then the decision of Scottish ministers on suspension, there are provisions in this bill which can be operated and then suspended and reimposed, that will lie with Scottish ministers. Where they are reserved areas, they will lie with UK ministers, but there are also areas in which consultation with Scottish ministers will have to take place. We would not intend to, as I've said earlier, immediately implement all of this bill. That would be utterly inappropriate. But if you read the bill, you will discover there are places where we can take action when we believe it is appropriate, and there are trigger points which we will get to and then we will address.
Due to the importance of this issue, I've decided to give another 5 minutes for questions. So that's Sarah Boyack, followed by Stewart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement? I was wondering, will the new bill add any new powers that will be needed by local authorities to act over the next few weeks and months? One issue that's been raised with me is the issue about powers around by-elections and whether they are cancelled or not. And is it possible to have an additional note about that issue? And are you involved in discussions with COSLA on those issues? Thank you.
Michael Russell.
Yes, there are a variety of powers for local authorities. We've mentioned social care assessments. The powers in by-elections are quite clear, and this has been a complex discussion between the administrations. But what the bill does in terms of Scottish by-elections is it will give the power to cancel by-elections, local authority by-elections, to the returning officer, and Scottish Parliament by-elections, should there be any, to the presiding officer, in both cases consulting with the Electoral Registration Board and Scottish ministers. A by-election due to take place in Clackmannanshire East today was cancelled at very short notice. I apologise for that, but this was to do with a change in policy with the UK Cabinet Office, which we were late to hear about yesterday. But from now on, I mean, and this will be a decision for returning officers, but I would find it highly unlikely that there will be any local government by-elections, certainly between now and the summer. There are a number due to take place in May, and I just think they will not happen. In terms of by-elections here, then there are none pending, but were there any, that would be a decision for consultation. I have to say, in terms of, just so I answer this and put this on the record, there are no proposals on this in terms of the Scottish Parliament election next year. There is already a legislative process for that were it to be required. But of course, one hopes that that will not be required, but we will keep everything under review.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Adam Tonkin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what role the Scottish Government has had in ensuring that the policy paper outlining the legislation accurately reflects the areas of the legislation that fall within the devolved competences?
Michael Russell.
We believe it does. I mean, I can't vouch for every single word in it, but I believe that it does. And of course, we are making here clear our position, and there will be other material that we can publish if we choose to do so.
Adam Tompkins, followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned human rights in his statement. Now, under the Human Rights Act and under the European Convention on Human Rights, countries can derogate from human rights in time of war or other public emergency threatening the life of the nation. Can I ask this? Is it the Scottish Government's view that the coronavirus crisis is or might become a public emergency threatening the life of the nation within the meaning of Article 15 of the ECHR? And if so, does the Scottish Government, sorry, Presiding Officer, and if so, does the Scottish Government anticipate that it might in due course become necessary to take powers that derogate from certain of our human rights protections?
I don't want to give a definitive answer to that. It's probably not for me to do so in any case. What I can say is I recognise it. It was a subject of discussion I had briefly with the Scottish Human Rights Commission today. There is no doubt that there is a balancing act to be had, but also that derogation exists. But I do hope that we are always conscious of the need to respect human rights and to do so in the best way we possibly can, commensurate with the emergency we face. And I know neither Mr Tompkins or I have any difference about the extraordinarily grave nature of the emergency that exists. And we will work at the best we can together to face that emergency. Whether or not I'm prepared to use those words in the way that Mr Tompkins used them, well, I suspect it's for others to do so, not for me.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank Presiding Officer. Given the unprecedented nature of the emergency we're facing, Cabinet Secretary, do you agree that it might be inevitable that there will be some mistakes made with this bill, but actually what is more important is the speed that we get this through Parliament to protect the people of Scotland? And can he confirm that the LCM will be coming to the Finance and Constitution Committee? And has further consideration in regard to the Scottish Government's bill been given to using the whole Parliament chamber to consider that particular legislation rather than allocating it to any particular committee? Because I think that might not be a bad way forward.
Michael Russell.
I think both of those points of view are very well made. First of all, in terms of using the Parliament as a committee, essentially a committee of the whole Parliament, that will be for the Parliamentary Bureau to decide, but it would seem to me an interesting proposal. So we will certainly be willing, if that is the mood of the Parliament, we are absolutely willing to do so. In terms of mistakes, yes, I do accept that. I mean, this is legislation that has to go through. I'm amazed at the speed at which officials have been able to bring this to a fully formed state. We have a lot of work still to do. This bill will not be perfect. No bill that this chamber has ever received has been perfect. But it is absolutely essential we do it now.
That concludes the statement and questions. from the Cabinet Secretary. Apologies to Neil Finlay and Andy Whiteman for not being able to ask their questions. And we'll move on to the next item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. We're going to move on to the next item of business, which is moving of a business motion to Mr. Day. So the next item is consideration of business motion 21307 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. Can I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 21307 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. So turning now to proceedings on the FGM bill, members should have with them the bill as amended at stage 2, the marshalled list and the grouping of amendments. I would just remind members that we'll sound the division bell for the first division of the afternoon. At that point, there will be a 30-second vote. Thereafter, there will be a 1-minute vote if there should be a division following a debate and a grouping. Any member who wishes to speak to any amendment should press their button to speak immediately after I call the grouping. So we'll now turn to the marshalled list, and I call Amendment 1. This is on provision of practical support. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I would remind members that if Amendment 1 is agreed to, then I cannot call Amendments 2 and 3 as they will be preempted. I call the Minister, Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. At stage 2, I indicated that I would bring forward amendments at stage 3 to ensure the bill reflects the importance of ensuring that women and girls who are seeking an FGM protection order receive appropriate and necessary support from frontline bodies. These are intended to meet the spirit of the committee's work and the view they expressed at both stage 1 and 2. Since stage 2, I've taken forward discussions with frontline third sector providers and statutory bodies about the bill as amended. Third sector bodies submitted a joint letter, and Social Work Scotland have written one too, and I hope members have had a chance to look at those. I want to pay tribute at the outset to the important work the Equality and Human Rights Committee have done throughout this process, Presiding Officer, to ensure that we have the best possible legislation that will protect women and girls, prevent FGM from happening in the first place. Although I disagreed with Oliver Mundell's amendment at stage 2, I completely understood what he was trying to achieve in pressing them, and I understand the committee's strong desire to ensure that women and girls receive appropriate support and that their identities are not disclosed, given the particularly sensitive and personal issues that arise in relation to FGM, and the importance of ensuring that they are protected. I want to thank Oliver Mundell for engaging with this issue. I am sorry that he cannot be here today to speak to his own amendments, but hopefully I will do the spirit behind them, the spirit of what he was trying to do behind them. I hope I'll give them some justice today. At stage 2, I indicated that I would bring forward amendments to deliver on the committee's aspiration in a sensible and balanced way. In doing so, I have sought to address stakeholder concerns that court-designed and directed support within the FGM protection order would be so precise and directive it could risk removing the benefits of a professional assessment of need and tailored support. This assessment is best carried out by those who provide complex support packages on a day-to-day basis. Our amendments therefore place the responsibility for determining appropriate support in the hands of frontline professional experts. This provides for a more balanced and sensible approach that starts from the basis that public bodies themselves, in partnership with the third sector organisations and with the needs of the individual at its heart. These people, I think, are best placed to identify and deliver the package of support that's necessary. That is why my amendments first allows the court to require a public body to carefully consider what support is needed and then require the public body to provide that considered support as appropriate and as reasonably as practicable. They ensure that vulnerable women and girls do not have to repeatedly attend court to have their support requirements varied, which I am sure that everyone will agree is not desirable. I note that Oliver Mundel's amendments to stage 3 provide for a power for ministers to issue guidance to the courts in carrying out the duties in a case. This is not something that ministers would ever do so, as it would run counter to the independence of the judiciary. Our amendments respect both the proper role of the courts in these matters and its judicial independence from ministers. Oliver Mundel's amendments provide for the court to name an appointed person to oversee the order. I understand that the reason for this may be to prevent repeated court trips to vary the order as support needs to change. However, I can hopefully reassure the Chamber today, and Ms Davidson, who has taken forward Oliver Mundel's amendments, that repeated court trips to tweak support packages will also be ruled out in my approach. I have looked carefully at those brought forward by Mr Mundell, which I do think are needed, and I worry they could potentially cause confusion and tension between the protected person and the public body supporting them, meaning that despite mandating someone to do this, the court continues to have to step in and resolve any issues. We can all trust, I hope, our public bodies to make the right decisions and to provide support that has the needs of the protected person at its heart. But I want to be clear with the Chamber that the bill as a whole will provide guidance in relation to appropriate support too. Our statutory guidance at section 2 and 3 will spell out clearly to the public body who must have regard to it the seriousness of the order and the steps that they should have regard to in complying with it. In light of what I said above, it should be noted that our guidance is expressly prevented from applying to the courts. I think that Mr Mundell has acknowledged these issues here through his provision to modified subsection 5A by regulations. However, we have an opportunity to get this bill right today and would respectfully submit that my amendments are a better way forward. I believe that our proposals meet the spirit behind Oliver Mundel's amendments at stage 2 and the committee's majority support for them, in reinforcing the provision of support, but in a sensible and balanced way, ensuring that vulnerable women and girls who require support can access the right support in the right way, and that their needs are at the very heart of the process, that once the court has done its job, our public services are then freed to do theirs. As I said at stage 2, we all agree on the importance of supporting women and girls and their families, whether there is a current or future risk of FGM. It is certainly right that those who need support should have access to it. As you know, my entire approach to tackling FGM through our strategy, through our preventative work in communities and through this Act is to support vulnerable girls to ensure a person-centred approach. I think you would all agree that I am utterly committed to that, and we all want all we want to do is to ensure that we have good and competent legislation. That is our collective aspiration for any legislation which is passed in this chamber. And, Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 1 in my name.
Thank you very much, Minister. And can I call on Ruth Davidson to speak to Amendment 2 and the other amendments in this group?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The amendments tabled in the name of my colleague Oliver Mundell in this grouping are designed to address a number of practical and technical concerns that were raised at stage 2 when an amendment on the provision of direct practical support to those protected by an FGM order was passed by a majority of members at the committee. At the outset, we acknowledge that the Government has brought forward their own alternative amendments, and we recognise that those amendments, if passed, would represent an improvement on the bill as originally drafted. It is my colleague's belief that they don't give everything that the committee members were looking for, but he does recognise that they may be more practical for exactly the reasons that have just been outlined by the Minister. We are nevertheless still keen to explain to Parliament the reasons for the amendments laid down by my colleague, to thank all those who came and who gave evidence at the committee, and to demonstrate that the points that were raised in the committee by SNP members in particular have been listened to. So in terms of the amendments themselves, Amendment 1, as the Minister has clarified, it clarifies that any direction from the courts would be limited to public bodies as defined under the 1998 Scotland Act. There had been concerns at stage 2 that unfair or unreasonable burdens could be placed on third sector organisations, and that had not been the intention. On Amendment 3, makes clear that any support outlined may be immediate or ongoing. Amendment 5 would allow for the courts to appoint a suitable individual to take charge of arrangements moving forward, and would allow a mechanism for any support to be reviewed without returning to court. Again, that had been a specific concern that had been raised at stage 2. I also know that our colleague across the chamber, Mary Fee, was keen to see more detailed examples of what such support might include on the face of the bill, and this has been covered in Amendment 6, which would have been focused on health, housing, financial support and education as a starting point. Amendments 7, 8 and 9 speak to the protections we seek for the individual at the heart of any decision, and it offered direction to the court, and it gave scope to ministers to issue guidance. So that was the rationale for these amendments being tabled. However, we recognise that the Minister has herself taken on board a great number of the concerns that were raised at stage 2. We thank her for that, and to that end I seek permission not to move the amendments in the name of Oliver Mundell, and to say that we will support the Government's amendments in their stead.
Thank you very much. I call John Finney to be followed by Angela Constance. John Finney.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Green Party aren't represented in the Equality and Human Rights Committee, but we're very grateful for the work that they do and monitored it closely and are supportive of the Government bill. I had involvement in this issue through previous involvement in the Equalities Committee and in the Justice Committee, and I'm aware of the sensitivities around and the perniciousness of the practice. And we, in each of these occasions where I was previously involved, we called on the expertise of many people. And this bill, as I understand, is about strengthening the protections, and I don't think there's any doubt that that's what everyone has sought to do. I should declare my interest as a member of the cross-party group on men's violence against women and girls, and the role that Scottish Women's Aid are playing in informing previous discussions on this is important, as is the various other groups in Gender, Amina, Shahilia and Shakti. And of course, reference has been made by the Minister to the letter from Social Work Scotland. I think we ignore at our peril the wisdom of the practitioners on this particular issue there, and when they talk about, and I quote here from the letter from Scottish Women's Aid signed by these groups I mentioned and indeed many others, including academics, when they talk about unforeseen consequences, undermining the efficacy of the bill and will prove harmful to victims and survivors, I think we have to pay heed. Given the comments of Ms Davidson, I wouldn't propose to say much more than that, but other than entirely supportive of the Minister's Amendment 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Finney. I call Angela Constance to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I wanted to speak in support of Amendment 1 and 10 in the name of the Minister today. I'm a member of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee, and these amendments seek to address some of the difficulties caused by some amendments, as discussed by Ms Davidson in terms of what happened at stage 2. And it's fair to say that committee was united in agreeing that endeavours to include practical support in FGM protection orders to reduce ongoing risk and harm were based on the very best of intentions, but we were divided on the practical effect and impact of Mr Mundell's proposition. And I do nonetheless very much welcome the position taken by Ruth Davison today on behalf of Mr Mundell, and I would like to put on record that Mr Mundell was a very diligent member of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee and cared deeply about the passage of this bill, and I think genuinely sought, despite our differences, to make it the best possible legislation. I come to this bill as someone who has many years of frontline experience in assessing vulnerable people or those at risk or those who present a risk. I've made many applications and recommendations to courts, to tribunals and to parole boards. Admittedly, that frontline experience is somewhat old now, over a decade. But those of us with this experience will have wrestled with the very delicate balance between the responsibilities, the competencies and the expertise between the courts on the one hand and service providers on the other. And what the Minister's amendments are trying to ensure is that when the courts impose duties, that they are actually based on assessed need and professional judgment. Presiding Officer, John Finlay has already drawn to Chamber's attention that the correspondence that committee received on behalf of Scottish Women's Aid, signed by other organisations, including Shakti's Women's Aid, Multicultural Family Base, Dundee International Women's Centre, Sahelia, Amina, the Muslims Women's Resource Centre. And as he said, and I think that has been acknowledged by others, we will do well to pay heed to those services and workers who have the current frontline experience of trying to protect women and girls at risk of FGM. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Constance. I call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I won't say very much at all, just to echo what other members have said about the intent of Oliver Mundell's amendments at stage 1, which I was, or stage 2 rather, which I was quite happy to support, imperfect as they were and as he admitted they were. However, I do think the Scottish Government have done a great deal of work to bring parties together to discuss opposition plans to ameliorate the concerns that we had at stage 2, and so I'm happy to support the Government in this regard.
Thank you very much. I call Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've not got a lot to add to what my colleagues have already said, particularly Angela Constance here, I think, summed it up pretty well. I do rise to support Amendments 1 and 10 in the name of the Minister. I welcome as well Ruth Davidson's approach today, and I think she did sum up where Oliver Mundell was coming from, and the fact that the Government amendments have captured perhaps where he was trying to go. There was concerns that I shared along with others around some of the risks that were presented at stage 2 about you know, the support being so precise and directive that it could minimise the benefits of a professional assessment and tailored approach, and also those complex support packages that we know is in place. But I think in the spirit of all things just now in the current climate, I welcome the Conservative approach to these amendments today.
Thank you very much. And can I call on the Minister to wind up in this section?
Yeah, I'll not take a lot of time either, Presiding Officer. I want to just put on record my grateful thanks to Oliver Mundell and Ms Davidson for bringing forward their position today. It's incredibly helpful when we work together like this. Everybody in the Chamber's drawn attention to the letter that was sent in from the organisations, and these organisations are the ones who do that day-to-day work in really complex situations. But I would quite like to just again, you know, reiterate my commitment that when we formulate the guidance for this bill, because part of it is you know, formulating that statutory guidance, that this collegiate approach that we've taken with the committee, with stakeholders and with other members across the chamber will be absolutely open as well. John Finlay raised a few points too from the letter as well, and he talked about these people are the experts. I think we should always remember that the stakeholders who do this every day are the experts, and Angela Constance talked about getting that balance right between the competency of the court and statutory bodies and their duties, and should the duties be imposed, that they are based on assessed need. Both Alex Cole-Hamilton and Fulton McGregor came from that same position as well, about ensuring the complex needs and the persons at the heart of it. I think the whole core of this bill is to ensure that those little girls who could be at risk or have been victims, or their sisters or their mums, are protected through this bill. And I think we do ourselves proud today in moving this amendment forward and moving forward with the bill too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we'll move to the question. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I'm going to call Amendments 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. And in the name of Oliver Mundell, I just want to confirm with Ms Davidson they're not moved. Those are not moved. So we're now going to turn to Group 2. I'll just check that. Yeah, I'm a 10 later. Group 2, extraterritorial jurisdiction. Can I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Minister in a group on its own? Minister to move and speak to Amendment 4.
Thank you again, Presiding Officer. This is just a technical amendment that I've brought forward to make clear that an FGM protection order is not to be used to regulate matters unconnected to Scotland. While the bill currently reiterates the powers of the Sheriff to decline jurisdiction in such an instance, I consider it to be prudent to put the matter beyond any doubt. This technical amendment makes clear that in addition to FGM protection orders covering individuals ordinarily resident in Scotland, irrespective of whether they are a UK national or not and irrespective of their immigration status, it can also cover any person within Scotland. This will ensure that an FGM protection order can be sought to protect even the most transient of visitors. By way of an example, say Police Scotland received credible intelligence that a non-UK national girl who is due to visit Scotland could be subjected to FGM when she goes home. Our bill will operate to allow them, while the girl is here, to seek an FGM protection order and in turn to protect that girl from future harm. This amendment does not change that, but it does put beyond a doubt that an FGM protection order cannot be used in relation to circumstances where there is no connection to Scotland. This is because it is important that we take a proportionate approach here, and jurisdiction should not be extended to unduly interfere in the affairs of sovereign nations and their citizens. We do not want to see a Scottish Sheriff issuing an FGM protection order in relation to a woman or girl, or indeed a potential perpetrator who has never set foot in Scotland, has no connection to this country and has never had any intention of coming here. It is not for us to interfere in the role of the state in keeping that woman or girl safe or holding that potential perpetrator of the FGM to account. However, the bill remains deliberately drafted to provide for the robust protection of girls who may be taken from Scotland to be abused. Further, it is equally robust in tackling non-Scottish perpetrators who may come here to carry out this form of abuse, irrespective of whether a potential victim has been identified or not. This amendment makes no difference to that comprehensive approach, and I move Amendment 2 in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call on Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. This is a technical amendment and we have no particular comments to make on the group's support, barring to say that we support the government's approach, which seems sensible, and we think that it does strengthen the existing provisions.
Thank you very much. So the question is that amendment... Sorry, does the Minister wish to add any further comments? No. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 10 in the name of the Minister, just previously debated? Minister to move formally.
Move formally.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So turn to our last group, Group 3, Provision for Anonymity. Can I call Amendment 11 in the name of the Minister, grouped with the amendments as shown? And I would remind members that if Amendment 11 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16 as they will be preempted. Minister to speak to and move Amendment 11. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Equality and Human Rights Committee and I both acknowledged at Stage 2, we all know that individuals may wish to be made anonymous for a number of reasons, and the needs of the person who is seeking protection from harm will always be at the absolute heart of everything we are trying to do here. In the context of an FGM protection order, it is absolutely right that the court should consider that carefully and act in the best interests of the protected persons. At Stage 2, the committee were sympathetic to undoubtedly well-intentioned amendments from Oliver Mundell, and I was concerned that the workability of those amendments and that they granted, and what they granted was, in effect, automatic anonymity for perpetrators. I explained that the courts do already have powers at their disposal to grant anonymity, and there is no evidence to suggest they do not take their duties in this regard seriously, and that they are well placed to decide how best to exercise such powers in a given case. However, the committee were sympathetic to the spirit of the amendments and voted to amend the bill at Stage 2 by inserting Oliver Mundell's provisions. As I have said, I understand why. My focus was then, and remains now, on ensuring that we have good and workable law that the courts are able to exercise, that works well for those it is designed to protect, and that does not have any unintended consequences. I welcome that Oliver Mundell has sought to fix some of the issues highlighted at stage 2, and as for Group 1, I have brought forward that I think are a balanced and sensible amendments to strengthen the bill in this area, and I hope that Parliament as a whole can get behind them. We are fortunate in this country. We have a highly skilled and professional judiciary, well used to ensuring the effective delivery of justice and the protection of persons' rights within that process. It is one of the reasons why we entrust these decisions of enormous personal importance to individuals, not to individuals but to courts. As part of this, we need to allow those courts to act justly and react to the facts of a case before them. I continue to believe that the courts have sufficient powers at their disposal, that they are well capable of exercising them, and they do so seriously. However, I have also listened carefully to the views of the committee and again note the spirit and good intentions behind the original amendment. I have therefore brought forward an amendment which will insert new sections 5FA, 5FB and 5FC into the bill, which meet the spirit and provide workable law that will meet the purpose of this bill. Together, these will require the court to consider using a new power to make an anonymity order. This requirement will arise not only where it receives an application for an FGM protection order, but also where the need for one arises in other civil proceedings. My amendments do not set out the detail of the measures to be used, but rather the effect that they are to achieve. And they are more expansive in that they require the court to properly consider the whole issue of anonymity. I think that Oliver Mundell's amendments are still a bit too narrow and could constrain the court in their thinking and in the actions that they could take. My amendments also leave the existing powers of the court untouched underneath them, guarding against any unforeseen circumstances that may arise which are out with the ambit and allowing the court to fall back on the existing powers if need be. I want to refer to the point in the briefing by Scottish Women's Aid and Gender which raised a specific concern in relation to the Government's amendments, namely around whether or not the courts would use this provision to make anonymity for perpetrators or potential perpetrators of FGM. They sought reassurances from the Government on how this is intended to apply in practice, and I am very happy to now do so. There are sometimes occasions where the court has to consider whether to make a perpetrator anonymous. However, the courts are clear that they would only do that in order to protect the victim. The crime can often take place within small, close-knit communities and families, and naming the perpetrator in these situations will automatically mean that in doing so we identify the victim, or the victim's sibling, or even maybe a brave mother who has taken a stand in seeking protection for her daughter. Journalists call this the jigsaw identification process. That is why our amendments require the court to consider making anyone anonymous with the key test of the health, safety and well-being of the protected person, and only the protected person in mind. This is a critical point. Yes, anonymity can, in extreme circumstances, be granted to a perpetrator, but only where to do so otherwise would harm the victim, or where there is a chance that the case to protect the victim may not proceed at all. If we do not allow the courts to do this, then it may inhibit women and girls at risk from coming forward if they think that a family member, even when that family member is a potential perpetrator, could be identified publicly. As part of the implementation of the bill, we will work closely with the Judicial Institute of Scotland to ensure that the courts understand the particular dynamics of FGM and that they respond appropriately. This is the right balance that focuses on building capacity of the whole system to respond effectively, while respecting the fundamental independence and wisdom of the judiciary. We will, of course, continue to work with frontline experts and communities themselves to shape this approach. In general, my amendments tidy up a number of technical issues around who can make an application, how the protected person's views should be taken into account, and how the court deals with issues such as variation, which, if supported by Parliament, will make the final bill better law. This is reflective of the complexity of the process. We have tested our thinking with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, the Faculty of Advocates, the Family Law Association and Just Right Scotland, who are specialist human rights lawyers who act with potential victims of FGM on a day-to-day basis. The Law Society of Scotland put in a submission yesterday supporting our approach. I will ensure that the court's decision-making continues to be underpinned by the needs of the protected person. That should be beyond any doubt. And in any way, that is the way that it's right for that protected person too. Presiding Officer, I would urge the Chamber to support our sensible and balanced amendment and delete Section 5CA from the bill. And I move Amendment 11 in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And can I call on Ruth Davidson to speak to Amendment 12 and the other amendments in this group?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This set of amendments in the name of Oliver Mundell aims to simplify the amendment around victim anonymity, and in particular we felt it more accurately captured what victims and survivors were asking for. Often they're looking for support and help, but they want to make sure that their details and those relating to the order do not make it into the public domain, which is not quite the same thing as anonymity. We believed that the new wording provided the necessary privacy and dignity that people were looking for and was self-evidently simpler and clearer than the Scottish Government's alternative. However, we do recognise the Minister's amendments, which again go further than she was willing to go at stage 2. And we welcome that, crucially, these would now move the issue of anonymity onto the face of the bill. As all speakers today have recognised, every member, official and minister has sought in good faith to act on behalf of some of Scotland's most vulnerable women and to give them the very best protection under the law that is in our power. Different methods perhaps, but the same motive and commitment. And with such assurances as we've just heard from the Minister on anonymity, I'm content not to move the amendments in Oliver Mundell's name.
Thank you very much, Mr Stevenson. Can I call John Finlay to be followed by Angela Constance?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The aim of this bill is to, and I quote here, strengthen the legal protection for women and girls at risk of female genital mutilation. And it then lays out how that's done. The very clear point that we have from the practitioners is that the courts already have the power of anonymity. We're all very familiar that people want things in the face of the bill for particular reasons, but one of the unintended consequences of that was the potential, and again quote from the letter, potential for promising perpetrators they will not be named. Now that's decidedly unhelpful. Equally unhelpful is when these organisations write and conclude by saying the potential for criminalising support efforts in organisations is particularly alarming. So I'm grateful for the amendments that the Ministers brought through that do strike the balance, and we will be supporting them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I call Angela Constance to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's worth reminding Chamber that the committee in its Stage 1 report on the issue of anonymity concluded, and I quote, that it strongly supports the principle that the views and wishes of victims and survivors should be paramount and central to court considerations, and the committee believes that anonymity on request is a reasonable expectation for victims of FGM and asks the Scottish Government to consider how this could be progressed. And the spirit of that, I think, is best reflected in the Minister's Amendments 11, 17 and 18. And in recognition that not one discrete bill will ever be the vehicle for wholesale legal change to our justice system, and that actually it is very problematic to try and carve out a separate set of arrangements for one particular set of victims and survivors. So I am pleased that the Minister has taken that recommendation forward as far as she can. I'm pleased that she has consulted an extensive range of stakeholders, including Just Right Scotland, who actually act for potential victims of FGM on a day-in, day-out basis. John Finney also reflected on the correspondence that we had received from practitioners in this field, and it is important to point out that courts must already withhold a person's identity in circumstances where the person faces a threat to life or limb, and further that they will do so where it is in the interests of justice to protect a party to proceedings from painful and humiliating disclosures of personal information where there is no public interest in doing so. These circumstances are a good description of FGM cases and offer significant protections already. And I've also, Presiding Officer, to conclude, I've listened very carefully to the Minister around her Amendment 17, which allows the court to consider making anyone anonymous, for example, a sibling, and that's very important. But crucially, as the Minister says, it can only grant anonymity to those who are not the protected person if they have the health, safety and well-being of that person at the very heart of their considerations. And I've listened very carefully to her explanation that her amendments will indeed remove the prospects of perpetrators being granted anonymity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Excuse me. And can I say at the outset, I absolutely echo a lot of what's been said by other members in this section and group of amendments. I was one of the members on the committee that supported Oliver Mundell's original attempt to get anonymity into the face of the bill. And we did so for very important reasons. That is, by definition, we're talking about communities where this is a massive cultural sensitivity, where fear of being named or being identified might act as an inhibitor to those who are victims or would be victims of female genital mutilation. And I understand, and we all recognised in the committee phase the imperfections in those amendments and the problems that Oliver Mundell's amendments at this stage were designed to rectify. However, I'd like to salute the government for moving a great distance once again to recognise the need for anonymity, a provision for anonymity within the bill. I think they get the balance right, and as such, we'll be supporting their amendments.
Thank you. I call Fulton McGregor.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I pressed my button to speak as much to keep the speakers, the list of speakers the exact same as from Group 1 as anything else, because I've not actually got a lot to add to what my colleagues have already said. Probably just to say, in addition to that, was that anonymity was probably the most pressing and key issue through Stage 1 and Stage 2, and we heard various approaches to that from witnesses during that time. We were, or I was, concerned about some of the suggestions put forward at Stage 2, which was agreed, but I think that Oliver Mundell himself and others who voted for it agreed that they weren't the finished article. So I do welcome the Minister's approach here, and I think that Oliver Mundell, who's obviously not here today, can be very happy with what he's achieved. And again, I'll just end by saying that I welcome the Conservative approach to today's amendments.
Thank you very much. And could I ask if the Minister wishes to make any comments by way of winding up?
Yeah, thank you. Again, Presiding Officer, again, my thanks to Ruth Davidson and to Oliver Mundell for shifting so far on this. But I really want to reiterate that I did get the spirit of where Oliver Mundell wanted to go, and I hope that that's reflected in the work that we've done, because some of the key points that have been raised by others, John Finney said, mentioned the issue about not criminalising charity and third sector organisations. It was a key part of the work that we needed to do there, so I wanted to put that beyond absolute doubt, that these stakeholders, charities and third sector providers are the people that we will need to do that very detailed and expert work. Angela Constance raised the issue around about the views and the wishes of the victim at its heart. I can't reiterate that enough to say that that's what we attempted to do here, and the actions that we've taken, you know, along with the law. Because she's absolutely right, this will not be just the law will make the difference here. It will be the work we do with stakeholders, that we work we do with guidance, and the work that we do with our FGM action plan. And she raised a really important issue here about ensuring that we have a broad enough scope in this amendment that allows for sibling sisters and maybe a mother or a grandmother to be protected too. Alec Cole-Hamilton brought up a really clear indication, and one of the reasons why this is such a sensitive and complex issue, and that is the fear of being named in a community, and that was raised with me over and over and over again, and I know that it was with the committee by communities and stakeholders, and again we wanted to make sure we gave that commitment to, and along again with Fulton McGregor and his comments and backing all of that up. This is about protection of women and girls, Presiding Officer, and I think we have done a good job today again to put them at the heart of this, but ensuring those siblings and those others are protected as well is a key aspect, and I thank everyone for their contributions.
Thank you very much, Minister. And the question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And as I indicated earlier, that means that Amendments 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16 are preempted. So the next question is, or to call Amendment 17 in the name of the Minister. Can the Minister move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 18, Minister, to move formally?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that ends formal consideration of amendments. Now, as members will be aware, at this stage in proceedings, I'm required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is, whether it modifies the electoral system or franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In the case of this bill, it does no such thing. Therefore, the bill does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. So on that note, we are going to pass on to the next item of business shortly, which will be a debate on stage 3 on motion 21279 in the name of Christina McKelvey. Just be a short pause before we do so.
The next item of business is Stage 3 debate on motion 21279 in the name of Christina McKelvey on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Christina McKelvey to speak to and move the motion for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to open this Stage 3 debate on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. This is an important bill which will make a real difference to women and girls at risk of or who have experienced the abhorrent practice of FGM. Although we have had some debate around the provisions of the bill today, there is broad consensus, I believe, across the Chamber that this is the right thing to do. Like other forms of gender-based violence, FGM is a manifestation of power and the means of controlling the sexuality of women and girls. It is a form of violence against women and girls. And as Minister with responsibility for the Scottish Government work in this area, I am committed to preventing FGM in Scotland and ensuring that girls and women who are at risk of FGM are protected from harm. FGM, as we know, has been illegal here since 1985. What the FGM Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill seeks to do is to add to existing protections and improve the system response to women and girls at risk of harm. It is estimated that around 200 million girls and women across 30 countries have been subjected to FGM, and the prevalence of FGM in Scotland is difficult to estimate because of the hidden nature of the crime. A Scottish Refugee Council report in 2014 found that there are communities potentially affected by FGM every local authority area in Scotland, with the largest communities in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Dundee. So this is not a new issue, and this government has been taking action. In 2016, we published a National Action Plan to prevent and eradicate FGM in Scotland, and I would like to pay tribute to Angela Constance, my colleague who started this journey. I'm merely finishing her first steps. The purpose of the action plan is to foster an environment of prevention in Scotland and to improve the welfare and quality of life of FGM survivors. We are taking steps to engage with communities, raise awareness and improve the response of frontline services. This bill meets our commitment to strengthen legal protections for those at risk of FGM. The new protection order available means our public services and our courts are able to focus on the need to protect those persons at risk or those who have already suffered from FGM being carried out on them. Building on the experience in other jurisdictions in the UK and reflecting on the support in our consultation, this is an effective and proven approach to reducing risk to potential victims. To support the new protection orders, the bill places a duty on ministers to issue statutory guidance on protection orders and also a power to issue guidance on FGM more generally. We intend to focus our efforts on ensuring that this guidance is developed with community input at every single step, and that we are guided by what women and girls need from their public services. This is absolutely critical for me. It's nothing about us without us, which is a term that I use often, but I mean it. On that note, I'd like to bring my opening remarks to a conclusion, Presiding Officer, because I think we've said everything we need to say today. But I want to thank those both within this chamber today and out with the chamber who have worked closely with the government over the last 18 months to help get us to this point. I would like to thank the Equalities and Human Rights Committee under the leadership of Ruth Maguire, which undertook a significant level of detailed and thoughtful scrutiny. This included working closely with community members with lived experiences to allow them to tell their story, and I know every member of that committee were personally touched by the stories that they heard. They visited frontline services to understand how protecting women and girls from FGM happens on the ground, and they took evidence from a range of experts and organisations, expert, detailed and very valuable scrutiny. I would like to commend the convener and members of the committee for their very thoughtful and considered work in this area, which has undoubtedly helped to ensure that we have the strongest possible legislation. Above all, I would like to thank those organisations and experts who have taken the time to share with myself and this Parliament their deep expertise in these matters. Organisations like Just Right Scotland, the Multicultural Family Base, the Shakti Women's Aid, Sahelia, Community Info Source, Amina Muslim Women's Resource Centre, the Kenyan Women in Scotland, Dundee International Women's Centre, as well as Dr Emma Jackson and Judy Wasage of the Glasgow Caledonia University, who work hard to ensure that the voices of women and girls are better heard in our policy making in this place. And I would especially like to thank Nena Bojang, a courageous survivor of the FGM and community activist who stood with me just outside the Parliament less than a year ago when we launched the bill. She says at the time that if just one girl did not have to experience what she had to, then this bill would be worth it. Presiding Officer, I am confident that if this Parliament votes to put this bill into law today, then we will be protecting more women and girls than we were yesterday, and that we will be one step further towards our goal of ultimately preventing and eradicating female genital mutilation. Thank you.
Before I call Michelle Ballantyne, can I remind those who are down to speak to press the request to speak buttons, please? And can I say we've got a few minutes in hand, so if anyone does want to intervene, I do have time to allow that to happen. Michelle Ballantyne for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased to be able to speak on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives this evening as we bring this bill to a close and hopefully push it through Parliament at the end of the day. I have spoken previously in this chamber about my own personal experience of having to hand over a baby as a nurse that was being taken out of the country to experience FGM. It's played on me most of my life, and for that reason alone, I welcome this bill's arrival and hope that it will go on to prevent that ever happening to anybody else again. The intentions of this bill are indeed admirable, and it is a symbol of the things that this Parliament can achieve when all parties come together. But I have to say the bill on its own won't be enough. It's also important that awareness is raised around the bill to ensure that it has effect. As Police Scotland remark in their submission, it is imperative that clear guidance must be put in place for the broad spectrum of individuals or organisations in order that any potential breach of the conditions is effectively policed. And the same point applies to ensuring a strong level of communication with communities where there have been previous cases of FGM. If people are to report the crime of FGM, it is vitally important that they understand the implications of these orders and where the law stands now on this issue. Without that key effort, all the legislation in the world will not have any effect in bringing more cases to court or ensuring those prosecutions are successful, or perhaps more importantly, preventing it even coming to that stage in the first place. I know the Scottish Government have been active on this issue through the group implementing the National Action Plan, but I do feel it is worth repeating, as it is the only way we will succeed in eradicating this vile practice. Deputy Presiding Officer, I want to make a mention of the Scottish Conservative amendments to this legislation too. The Conservatives have always been highly supportive of this legislation, but as my colleague Ruth Davison just outlined, we did have some concerns in terms of the practical and technical considerations involved in the bill. And I'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to my colleague Oliver Mundell, who sadly wasn't able to be here to speak to his amendments. But he did put in a lot of work, very much around trying to represent the views and experiences of those who gave evidence, which of course they did so very bravely on what is a very difficult subject to talk about. And he was very keen that those views were incorporated and that they made it to the face of the bill and provided the kind of support that they indeed had asked for. But we do accept, as Ruth Davison said during the amendment discussion, that the government has implemented the changes we sought to make in their principles. And while the bill isn't perfect, I am glad to see the amended bill has provided for greater support than originally planned, because at the end of the day, support and communication are the keys behind this. If this bill is going to be successful, I do hope the government will expand their activities in this area, and so that it keeps pace with the requirements of this piece of legislation, because women who go through this do need a vast amount of support, not only personally in terms of managing their lives, but if we are going to prosecute or take people to court as a result of this, they're going to need an inordinate amount of support and protection so that they can continue to live within their communities. Presiding Officer, I would like to raise the subject of preventative offences. When giving evidence to the Equalities Committee, Police Scotland have noted that there is a potential gap in the legislation regarding additional preventative offences where persons have in their possessions items indicative of intending to carry out FGM. And while I recognise that in some cases it may be hard to discern whether these items may be used for carrying out FGM, particularly where there are ceremonies of a more ritualistic kind, it will probably be clear that the potential offender intends to commit a crime, much as somebody carrying drug paraphernalia suggests another type of behaviour. I think it would be worth exploring these issues in the guidance that will be issued to FGM, to police, organisations and the public, so that people can recognise equipment indicative of FGM wherever they see it, and understand that there are reporting mechanisms available. Whether we needed a full provision in the bill was perhaps a different question, but until we have stronger data on the way FGM is conducted, it would probably have been unwise to include a potentially far-reaching amendment liable to abuse. On a final note, I wish to touch upon a point made by the Law Society of Scotland in their briefing for today, and which I mentioned a moment ago. They ask how the bill's success and effectiveness will be measured once it has been implemented, particularly given how low conviction rates have been in the past. A robust way of collecting this information will be useful not only to improve reporting procedures, but to demonstrate the bill's efficacy. This will be an important consideration going forward, and one I would urge the ministers to look at and report back to Parliament on in due course. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives are fully supportive of this bill and support the direction taken by the Scottish Government here. As I said earlier, my colleagues have laid out this afternoon, it needs to be a strong, comprehensive piece of legislation that is supported by the right training, the right guidance and the resources to back it up. And ultimately, we must absolutely support the victims and those who are at threat of this really terrible crime, because although many of us have never experienced it or don't have it experienced it within our families, for those who do, it is absolutely life-destroying. So can I just say thank you for bringing it forward. I presume and hope it will go through tonight, and I hope it will make a big difference to those women out there. Thank you.
Before I call Pauline McNeill, just to let the Chamber know that we have fewer speakers than expected when the debate was timed, so it's likely that decision time will be a bit early. And I call on Pauline McNeill. Around 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to speak for Scottish Labour. And I want to begin by thanking Oliver Mundell, Ruth Maguire and Mary Fee and the committee for being excellent parliamentarians and doing the work that you would expect them to do, but I think it's of a high quality. I also want to put on record my thanks to Angela Constance in her previous ministerial and to Christina McKelvey, who is taking this bill through so ably. And of course, the protection of women and girls is something that is universally of concern to all of us. I haven't previously been involved in the debate, but I have followed it from its outset. Because we know that an estimated 1 in 20 girls and women in the world have undergone some form of female genital mutilation, and according to figures from the UN, that is. And in 2020 alone, there are 4.1 million girls around the world who are at risk of undergoing female genital mutilation. The United Nations is calling for a complete ban, and rightly so, on FGM and want to see the practice end worldwide by 2030. But it did strike me that there's another 10 years of this brutal crime, and I'd hope that the UN might be able to bring that date a bit further forward. It is nearly always carried out on minors and is a violation of rights of girls. Female genital mutilation has absolutely no health benefits. It harms girls and women because it interferes with the natural functions of their bodies. There is a ban in Scotland, and it's also illegal to help someone commit AFGM as well as take someone out of the country to undergo FGM. This legislation is vitally important as it provides increased protection for those girls at increased risk of being under pressure to undergo this abhorrent and dangerous practice. I followed carefully the amendments this afternoon taken by the Minister on the particular question of anonymity, an absolutely vital aspect of the legislation to protect women and girls from future harm. The bill will allow a court to make a protection order protect a person at risk of being subjected, and so therefore Labour is delighted to support the principles and will vote at stage 3 tonight. Doctors in Scotland have treated victims of FGM in more than 230 occasions over the 2 years of 2017 and 2018. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde said it had identified women with FGM on at least 138 occasions over this period. And NHS Lothian, covering Edinburgh, said that there were 93 occasions where it was noted. Quite shocking that we still face this in Scotland. Dr Duncan McCormick, consultant in public health medicine at NHS Lothian, has pointed out it is a form of abuse, gender-based violence, and has serious short and long-term and physical and psychological consequences. All survivors have appalling stories about what has happened to them, and I know members have shared these horrible stories in the Parliament chamber before. I just want to finish on this one. Leisha tells her story. I was sent to Guinea for the summer. I was mutilated along with my baby sister. She was 9, I was 11. After the circumcision, I didn't know what happened exactly, but she died. She was my best friend. After the ritual, I was placed in a room with other girls and men not allowed to see us. I remember not seeing my family for days. I can't remember exactly how long. When I finally returned home and saw my family, and they were happy and proud that I was finally a woman. Sex is painful and I hate it. I hate being touched. It feels like rape every time. I cry inside. I cry out loud. My husband does not care because it does not hurt him. I had type 3 FGM and it was reopened after we were married. This kind of pain is typical of a survivor of FGM, and the story shows that some even die from the procedure. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm delighted that the Scottish Government has accepted the recommendations of the committee to support the statutory guidance with the appropriate professional training so that FGM protection orders are used appropriately and implemented effectively. And I think Michelle Ballantyne makes an important point about the education that's required in order to accompany the protection order and the crime that we now have in Scots law. This enhanced protection should be vital in helping to protect vulnerable girls from this life-changing and threatening practice. I'm delighted that we will be voting for this at stage 3 tonight. It is a global issue, an issue across the world. Scotland has done the right thing. I think we can say that we have done everything in our power to protect girls, but we know that we need to champion this issue across the globe. Thank you.
Call Alex Cole-Hamilton for around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start as Deputy Convener of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee by offering my sincere thanks to the clerks, the witnesses and the organisations who took us through this very sensitive but very important bill. Deputy Presiding Officer, I think this bill is a monument to the strength of our democracy, that it comes even in the teeth of the worst of international crises. The business of public policy, the business of government must continue. And this is an example of a bill that may only affect a very, very small few of our fellow citizens, but they are, by nature, a very vulnerable few. It is an indictment of our efforts to realise gender equality and the rights of women that we have to pass an act like this in Scotland in 2020. It typifies the cultural practice of female genital mutilation, typifies men's attempts to exert power and control over women that has existed for eons, and it's time that we finally stamp that out. And with this bill, we are extending a layer of protection onto many layers of protection, but it is a vital one. The Minister is quite right to say in her opening remarks that this is a hidden practice, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and we shouldn't look at our culture and our country and think that we've got it right and that these acts of savagery or barbarism, withdraw that word, that's a terrible word to use, but that these acts are in any way appropriate in our country, and they do happen. And we have some statistics on that. Globally, we see 3 million girls in any given year that this applies to. And in Scotland, we have 350 babies born each year, girls to mothers from countries where female genital mutilation takes place, where it is the cultural norm. And it is the teeth of this bill around the Female Genital Mutilation Protection Order, in the words of Leith and Bartholomew, which give it its absolute teeth. He's from the FGM Centre, and it gives women agency and power, not only to take a stance and protect herself, but also to protect her child. And I think those words really struck home to me as we heard them in evidence, and it has been said several times in debates around this bill, that it gives agency and power to women. It reverses what I think that the practice of FGM has sought to do in the millennia that it has been practiced, in giving women the power to defend themselves against the brutality of men. Until this point in our history, there has not been any real and legal impediment to the practice. We have not been able to stop babies or children being taken overseas, or even it happening to them at home, because it is such a hidden practice, because it is such a sensitive practice that people will go to great lengths to cover up. I welcome the distance the government has gone, as I said in our discussion over the Stage 3 amendments around the issue of anonymity. It is vital that we allow anonymity for girls and young women in these cultures to come forward, because by nature they are very vulnerable. They have perhaps a great sense of shame about putting their hand up and saying that they don't want it to be happening to them, and they may fear ostracization if their name is known in the wider communities. But I think we have got to a point where those women are protected. Finally, can I say that the implementation of this bill will be absolutely critical to getting it right. Any bill is only as good as its implementation phase, and I very much welcome the efforts the government is going to plan focus groups in affected communities to shape pathways and structures around it. Can I finish by reiterating my thanks to everyone who participated in this bill, not least the organisations like Sohilia, and Sohilia who are becoming more and more involved in the work of this Parliament as they help us to help marginalised groups. And I commend this bill to the Chamber. Thank you.
Now call Christina McKelvey to wind up the debate. If you could take us to decision time, please, at 10:02.
Oh, God, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm really pleased to be closing this debate today on the Stage 3 of the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. And Alec Cole-Hamilton in his open remarks said that this was a hidden practice, but one we know that actually happens, therefore we shouldn't think that it doesn't. And the reason why we know this is the two stories that we heard today from both Michelle Ballantyne and Pauline McNeill. Michelle Ballantyne talked about the baby girl that she had to hand back when she knew that baby was at risk. This bill will protect that baby now and protect a professional like Michelle Ballantyne in her role. And Pauline McNeill talked about that wee girl's story. For some wee girls are taken to a birthday party, they're taken to an outing by an auntie or a granny, and they don't know what's coming to them. And that's why it may be hidden, but we know these stories, and these stories are the reason why we are doing what we are doing. There was a couple of really key parts in everybody's speeches where they wanted some more information. Michelle Ballantyne specifically asked about data collection. That's something that we have taken on board through the process of this, and I've already committed to developing a data collection strand of work through our FGM action plan, the National Action Plan work that we're doing in partnership with health and other organisations who are relevant. Michelle Ballantyne also asked about FGM equipment, which was something that was raised with me at the beginning of this whole process. And we did do some work with Police Scotland on this. We don't need a new offence for it, because that will already be caught by the law, and it being an offence to attempt to break a FGM protection order, and that includes the carrying of the equipment in order to do that. So Police Scotland already have powers to do this. Yeah.
Michelle Ballantyne.
Can I ask for a slight clarification on that? Because my understanding was that if somebody was stopped in possession of equipment, they couldn't be prosecuted for that. that they had to actually have done something to progress the use. So could I just check that?
So yeah, if we pass the law today in the purpose of the work of the FGM protection order, if we know that person is using that equipment to either carry out FGM or to attempt to carry out FGM, they will be convicted. It will be a criminal conviction. So we have got that covered off. Okay, hopefully that reassures you. We can talk more about it if you want. The other issue that lots of people raised in their contributions today was around about guidance, and I want to give some reassurance around guidance and what we want to do with guidance. And I'd like to draw the Chamber's attention to page 12 of the Year 3 report, which highlights what the sets of guidance will include. Both sets of guidance will set out the policy and legal context for the work on FGM. The guidance on protection orders will describe the order, set out the roles and responsibilities and cover relevant matters such as application processes, costs and access to legal aid. And I want to say something about legal aid as well, because that was raised at stage 2. And at that point, we looked at where can we ensure that access to legal aid is given to someone who is accessing an FGM protection order. And, Presiding Officer, I'd like to inform the Chamber that at stage 2 I did implement the regulation change to the legal aid list to ensure that FGM protection orders were covered on it. And that would mean that people would get access to legal aid as well. The other part of the guidance on FGM generally will provide a comprehensive summary of issues around FGM and set out actions for Chief Executive, Directors and Senior Managers to whom the guidance will apply. Both sets of guidance will be shaped through very close community engagement and work with stakeholders, utilising the expertise of members of the FGM National Implementation Group. And that work will commence immediately following royal assent. The other issues that were raised with me today that were incredibly important by all of the speakers were around implementation and how we will do that. So following royal assent, the work will be complemented by the formal consultation on draft guidance covering FGM protection orders and FGM generally later in 2020. Should we have the space to do that, given the current climate in which we're all facing right now. But it is our intention to do that formal consultation and give the stakeholders again their opinions and parliamentarians their opinions to ensure that the implementation of the orders and the guidance for it matches what we want to see being done. So to assist with the effective operation of future statutory guidance in FGM, we will work with stakeholders to ensure that the core training adequately reflects the position on FGM, including the updated legislation. And taking this work forward, we will engage with communities at the outset and of the process and ensure that the guidance in particular reflects the needs of women and girls. And as I said, in relation to that on legal aid, there was a question asked about legal aid, about whether an individual, a child or legal aid would be normally subject to testing of the income of the parents, but only where it is not unjust and inequitable to do so. We suspect that in all cases that will be the case, so legal aid would be ordinarily available to anyone accessing that. But given FGM protection orders would often, maybe not always, involve consideration of restrictions on parents, we think it highly likely that such means testing would always be unjust and inequitable, and in these circumstances legal aid would be granted. And at stage 2, I indicated that I had instructed the preparations of the regulations, as I said, because that's the urgency of the matter, and these regulations will proceed as part of the implementation process of the bill. Presiding Officer, it's vital to emphasise that this bill is one part of our overall holistic approach to preventing and eradicating FGM. I know that everybody in their contributions wanted to make sure that we took that forward. Michelle Ballantyne in particular said legislation's not enough. We know that. But it's something that we can use in order to prevent and protect. But culture change, understanding, support and working with stakeholders and communities is one of the main ways that we want to do that. We've been doing it through our National Implementation and Action Plan, and we want to make sure we can continue that work. Last month, we just published our Year 3 Progress Report on our Action Plan to prevent and eradicate FGM, and I'm pleased to see that we are making good progress. And I would hope that people would go and have a look at that Year 3 report. It's got some good reading in it and tells us all the direction that we want to go in. But I do want to pay tribute to and recognise the hard work and dedication of our third sector partners in helping to drive that progress. Organisations who are doing vital work to raise awareness, challenge attitudes and support women and girls alongside the legislative measures that we will take will make the change that we all want to see. And I do want to commend frontline workers in the police, health, social work, who are all supporting women and girls going forward. We will continue to work together with stakeholders and communities in making every effort to build a Scotland where women and girls at risk of harm can be equally safe. And that means that wee girl that Polly McNeill spoke about, and it means that baby that Michelle Ballantyne spoke about as well. That's who this is all about. Presiding Officer, the abhorrent form of gender-based violence has impacted on nearly 200 million women and girls worldwide, as I said. And we know that there are those in Scotland who have been subject to it, and there are those at risk of it. One of the things that I wanted to do in issuing statutory guidance to bodies and other issues like that was to make sure that that person-centred approach was absolutely at the heart of everything that we need to do here. As a government, as a parliament, we must send a very, very strong message that FGM in Scotland will not be tolerated, that you will be believed, that you will be supported, you will be listened to, and we will look after you and protect you. And we need to take practical action to build on existing protections so that the risk of FGM taking place at all is reduced. The FGM Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill does both of those things. In future, girls and women can be better protected from harm, and importantly, FGM protection orders can be used to stop potential perpetrators of FGM in their tracks. Presiding Officer, when I launched this bill just outside this Parliament, just short of a year ago, I launched it with a woman called Nene Boyack, and if you haven't heard her story, you don't want to actually hear her story because it's absolutely horrifying. But at every step of the way in my work in this bill, I've had her front and foremost in my mind. Like Michelle Ballantyne with that baby, like Polly McNeill with that wee girl, like the conversation I had with John Finney about the parties that sometimes wee girls think they're going along to and how abhorrent that is. Those people are the people in front of our minds. They are Scottish citizens. They are wee girls. And this bill, passed in law today, will protect them all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our Stage 3 debate on the FGM Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. The next item of business is point of order. Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all appreciate the steps that you and your team have taken to help Parliament continue to do its work while putting safety measures in place for MSPs and workers during the COVID-19 crisis. However, while we are all, as MSPs, advising the public to maintain social distancing, that same public can see on their television screens members of Parliament crammed next to each other in the chamber less than a metre apart, even though some members are already absent and self-isolating. Can you therefore ask yourself, the Business Bureau and the corporate body to consider whether to put in place measures to ensure that MSPs maintain a safe distance in Parliament to protect not just their own health, but to contain the spread of the disease and to send a clear message to the general public about the importance of social distancing? Thank you.
Can I thank Joan McAlpine for advance notice of her point of order, and can I confirm that members of the corporate body and the Bureau are very conscious of health matters such as this and the importance. In fact, the Bureau considered this very matter this afternoon. As I outlined on Tuesday at the close of business, all our decisions are consistent with public health advice and are designed to minimise the impact of COVID-19 with a view to safely and sustainably delivering essential parliamentary business. In relation to attendance in the Chamber, while I do not wish to prevent members from participating in business, I am content that members are not required to be present in the Chamber unless they are participating in the current item of business. I am confident that we have sufficient capacity in the Chamber to allow members to maintain a safe distance, and I would invite members to apply their own common sense on this matter. Could we move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of revised business motion 21311 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a revision to Tuesday's business. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I I have no indication of any other member that wishes to speak on this motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 21311 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. And I would just, thank you, that is agreed. I would just note that that means that we will start business on Tuesday at 1:30 rather than 2. So we start, time for reflection will be 1:30 on Tuesday. Now, I am minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 to bring forward decision time to now. Could I invite the Minister to move such a motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So there's one question at decision time today. The question is that motion 21279 in the name of Christina McKelvey on the stage on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? No, sorry, I beg your pardon. This is stage 3 and we will have to move to a vote and members should press their voting buttons now. The result of the vote on motion 21279 in the name of Christina McKelvey is yes 84. There were no votes against, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill is passed. That concludes decision time and I close this meeting.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon as our First Minister has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73 and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balance stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.